8 a.m. in Dakar, Accra, and Lagos. It's 9 a.m. in Johannesburg, Windhoek, Harare. It's 10 a.m. in Nairobi and Addis. And it's time to talk gender and media. I've just seen someone from Myanmar. So welcome. We're going beyond Africa, in fact. So welcome everyone to this incredible panel of amazing speakers that we've got together today. This is Soul City Institute for Social Justice Gender Sensitivity session. Today, what we want to do is to engage in lively feminist conversations about gender and media, how it manifests, what it does, and what is required to change it, and what the reality of trying to dismantle patriarchy is across the continent, and what the regulatory environment is that we operate in. We really want to interrogate today what it means to produce social and behavior change communications, and what really is required to produce gripping dramas that also change society. We're doing this with an incredible list of speakers who are going to take us through various aspects of the Soul City Institute's program to its Disrupting Patriarchy project, which first encompassed actually an 8-part drama series, but then it pivoted because of COVID to a talk show as well as 1 minute feminist public service announcements. And we're going to talk about what it really meant to be able to produce feminist work and an environment in where we so often don't really truly understand what we mean by that, but also how we do that in a way that engages our audiences and actually helps to empower women in the industry, but also supports the advancements of the women's movement. So really an incredible program for today, and I'm really, really pleased to be here as part of it. The webinar actually is part of a bigger attempt to discuss how structural impediments in the industry might mitigate against women's advancement for the development of narratives that uproot deeply embedded tropes that are harmful to women and girls. Today's discussion, we want it to be lively, we want it to be deep, we want it to be engaging, but most of all, we want you to be able to take it away to whether you're a creative working in film, art, whether you're a journalist working in a newsroom, whether you're a communicator working in an NGO. We want this to be really practical. We want our speakers to be able to bring to the table the kinds of projects that they've been working on, the way they've been able to deal with challenges and deconstruct and reframe dominant narratives. I think our biggest challenge on the continent is that so often we work within the dominant narrative rather than rethinking the work that we actually do. And so what we want to be able to do really is to empower each and every one of us to be able to bring feminist messages to the center in an unapologetic manner. Um, um, I self-identify as a feminist. You don't need to identify as a feminist to find today's workshop useful. But really, what we want to do is to bring all our experiences to the table and to really look at what we can do in order to bring about the necessary change for women's empowerment. So I'm really, really excited to get started today, but I wanted to just pause for a minute and say to you that we are doing this workshop in May, in the aftermath of the May 3 Press Freedom Day commemoration. This year has been a special year because it marks 40 years from the Windhoek Declaration, and so truly a moment for us to pause and reflect how far we've come. And how far we've come has really brought us to a moment where there are still many, many press freedom challenges on the continent, but also a moment where we find how difficult it is to practice journalism that is truthful, that seeks to hold power to account, and very often for women journalists particularly, to practice journalism in an environment of great hostility against journalists and journalism, where we find that on social media women journalists particularly are being targeted, are being subjected to the most incredible online violence, and that violence has also spilled over to the assassination and the killings of women journalists in countries such as Mexico, Malta, and in fact across the globe. Right now, as we do this webinar, I can report that in many countries that that journalists, male and female, are actually living in fear and are operating as journalists in fear, and yet they still do their job. And so I want to acknowledge that today's work is being done in an environment where journalism as a public good has never been more important. The role we play in a democracy, the role we play in ensuring that people get the kind of information that they can make informed decisions in their lives has never been greater. And so, on that note, I really want to say there is not a better time or a more critical time for us to be doing a webinar on gender sensitivity in the media. We need to be able to break down, to rethink, and to be thinking in the way we report on issues in a way that doesn't deepen existing tropes, in a way that challenges stereotypes, but also in a way that helps to really promote change. And so, on that note, I really want to move on and speak and introduce our very, very first speaker. She holds a BA in social work honors from the University of Pretoria, but more importantly, I think she has decades, more than 2 decades of experience in the field of violence prevention, having worked in government and in civil society sector. Um, um, her credentials, academic, but in the field, are really incredible and valuable for our discussion today. When she was at the Gauteng Department of Community Safety, she led the directorate responsible for social crime prevention. And at the moment, she's also a board member, or rather, she's a former board member of People Opposing Women Abuse Power. So, without further ado, let me hand you over to Joan McKetsy, who's going to be talking about why gender and media really matters to GIZ and give us a brief overview of the incredible progress that they have been making in their program. So over to you, Joan.
Thank you very much, Paula, and good morning, everyone. And also a very warm welcome to all of you. And I just want to start by thanking Soul City for organizing this very important session today. And as already introduced, I'm Joan Mweketse, I work for GIZ. And Paula, thank you very much. You've already taken some of the notes that I've prepared by just briefly introducing the program. The PFP program, it's Partnership for Prevention of Violence Against Women and Girls in Southern Africa. Sorry. The PFP program that we are also implementing on behalf of the German Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development. The PFP program operates in 4 countries. We are in South Africa, Lesotho, Zambia, as well as in Zimbabwe. And we work very closely with our partners in contributing to bringing about the change and alter social norms and practices that continue to instigate gender-based violence. And this we do through 2 approaches. The one is really around strengthening the capacities of our partners for the coordinated implementation of gender-based violence across the countries that we're working in, as well as formulation of multi-stakeholder initiatives that serve to jointly implement what we call flagship project on the prevention of gender-based violence. The Step It Up for Gender Equality in Southern Africa Media is one such initiative that we are also implementing jointly with our partners. Violence emanates from deeply rooted biases, norms, and stereotypes that cause structural, psychosocial, unequal gender dynamics. We need to begin to challenge and change these norms and behaviors through high levels of prevention, efforts such as the gender sensitivity training being held today. What we consume across media platforms informs how we think about ourselves and society at large in terms of gender. Thus, the media, we believe that it plays a critical role in shaping and challenging stereotypical norms and standards and how we can prevent gender-based violence. The Step It Up for Gender Equality in South African Media has been established jointly with the UN Women to support the positive role the media and creative community can play through the influence they have on how we view and understand society. Key partners from civil society, government, as well as the media industry itself are part of this project. Over the past 2 years, the Step It Up project has initiated many interventions in the media, including the facilitation of an inclusive dialogue across the media sector involving government, civil society, as well as the private sector, the media organizations. We all, some of us were there, some of you might have been there in August 2019, where we came together for a conference to discuss the challenges that persist within the sector and hold it back from having a more impact. 3 key themes emerged from the conference that we held in 2019. Namely, there was also the need for gender-sensitive reporting, the need for unstereotyped storytelling, as well as the need to create a safe and equal environment behind the scenes. The session today is directly addressing the first need. Since the conference, the Step It Up project, together with its partners, worked on various efforts on driving change in the industry in terms of gender equality. We also have my colleague, Luxolo Matumela, who will also be elaborating more on this during the session today. The Step It Up project is committed to achieve behavioral change within the media and creative industry to create a more gender-sensitive, unstereotyped, equal and positive change-driven content, as well as creating a safe and equal production environment behind the scenes. I also believe that all of us, we have spent more time consuming media and entertainment content of all sorts, especially during the current pandemic that we find ourselves in. This might be another reason why this important intervention comes at the right time. Just to also reiterate that within GIZ, as the PFP program, we are really committed to continuing contributing towards creating change, especially also towards engaging with the media to emphasize the important role that it plays in gender-based violence prevention. I'm just looking forward to a vibrant and interesting discussion around gender sensitivity reporting and storytelling today. And yeah, I'm also emphasizing that we will be engaging more on what is it that we have been able to achieve as the Step It Up media flagship, together with the partners, in the presentation that Luxolo will be doing also during the session. So thank you very much. I think on behalf of all the partners that we have been working with, inclusive of Soul City, I think it's just welcoming everyone and really wishing ourselves a very kind of interesting deliberation in the session today. Thank you very much.
And Gail joins us now to really just talk about the context and the objectives for today's training, as well as an overview, Gail, please, of Soul City, the work it's done, and why this program was so important for the organization. So over to Gail now. Gail?
Oh, good morning, everyone. Hi, hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We're really excited about this webinar. As Paula said, I'm just going to start my timer so I don't go over. As Paula said, my job really is just to lay the context for today and just explain a little bit the genesis of the project and Soul City's approach to gender and the media. I'm going to try to share my screen. If that fails, I'm really just going to speak because I think I want to rather introduce, disabled join, I can't share. Okay, so I'm just really going to speak to some of the issues that were really pertinent for us as an institution in this project and just give a very, very brief overview. Now, some of you might remember the Soul City Institute for the groundbreaking television programs they made in the early 1990s. Soul City really pioneered social and behavior change communications, specifically around HIV, AIDS, TB, and violence against women, actually. They did really compelling narratives, television shows, high budget, and they really shifted the dial. Lebo Ramafoko, who really was part of the DNA as the ex-CEO and was with the organization for many years, is on the panel. I'm hoping she will be joining us today because she can really speak more to the history of that. But I just want to explain, perhaps for some of our local audience and our international audience, the change that Soul City has gone through. So we were a health and development communications NGO, essentially, and now we are an intersectional social justice institute focusing on girls and women. So briefly, I'm just going to run through our theory of change. So our strategies, what do? We resource young women's movements to drive change and to try to amplify their voices and their agency. So we really create platforms for young women through our Rise Clubs and our media work so that we can give women the knowledge that they can assert their own agency, that they understand what their entitlements are, and that they can, with informed consent, then get their rights. The other thing we do is we resource collaborations with different organizations. And the point of all of that really is to begin to challenge and shift patriarchal norms and structures. And then the other thing we do is we advocate for the building of feminist capacities in diverse organizations. We are very lucky in the South African context that we do work in a very enabling environment. Our constitution is globally recognized as one of the best in the world. I wanted to share my screen so I could just illustrate that, but I don't want to delay the process. Suffice to say that the bar for equality in South Africa is extremely high, which is why it makes this jurisdiction both difficult and challenging, but also exciting. We have 16 protected grounds in the equality clause of our constitution, 16, including race and color, sex and gender, belief and custom, religion. And so you see, it becomes very difficult then, not difficult, it becomes very challenging for us then to see the intersectionality. Well, we are then able to see the intersectionality of rights, right? That all of us have multiple identities and that we are all always experiencing multiple forms of oppression. And that's really our approach to intersectionality, the recognition that inequality is structural, it's tied to apartheid, it's tied to colonialism, and so is patriarchy. That patriarchy is definitely the focus of our work at Soul City, dismantling it. We do this, one, because we want to produce a cadre of feminists and activists and movements that are strengthened and resourced and able to I beg your pardon, mobilize and act for change. We want to raise feminist consciousness with improved recognition and rights and respect for the rights of young women and girls. And we want to see diverse organizations implementing feminist approaches and supporting young women's rights and well-being. And what we want to ultimately see are feminist movements of women and girls who understand and are able to assert and claim their human rights and are able to live with dignity and well-being and are able to reach their potential. It is worth mentioning that in the South African context, dignity is not a vague, nebulous feeling. Dignity is a justiciable right in South Africa. You can face both criminal and civil charges for impugning someone's dignity in the context of our country. Dignity is a right that is respected by the highest law in the land, and women's dignity is protected as a consequence. And we really want people to begin to understand dignity as a concept to well-being and to enabling women to achieve their full potential. So that's broadly what Soul City does at the moment. And I know a lot of people were confused about what we were doing because they know our old programs. We are still, a lot of those shows are still showing, people are still engaging with them. So that was the one thing I just wanted to speak to, the theory of change of Soul City. And then just a little bit to intersectionality. There has been, I mean, there's a lot of discussion around intersectionality. It has become a buzzword, but for the purposes of our gender and media project, we wanted to be very clear that we all understood the definition of intersectionality as it relates to our constitution and our context. So very broadly, intersectionality is the recognition that many crucial factors shape identity and that it is possible to simultaneously experience multiple oppressions. So that's the broad working definition that we work with, and that's Kimberly Crenshaw's. I'll come back to ours as Soul City. So really just to say that our constitution recognizes that race, gender, sexual orientation, sex, marital status, birth, disability, belief, ethnic or social origin, pregnancy, religion, age, culture, language, conscience, color, and race are protected grounds. Those are many intersecting protected grounds. And that's the point from which we depart as an organization, that the Constitution and the Equality Clause prohibit unfair discrimination on one or more of those grounds. Both our Constitution and our Equality Act recognize that inequality and discrimination are structural. Let me just move this, sorry, I just need to see my screen on the side. So our Equality Act prohibits unfair discrimination. Our Equality Act further states in its preamble, and I want to just read the quote, which is pertinent. It says, "The consolidation of democracy in our country requires the eradication of social and economic inequalities, especially those that are systemic in nature, which are generated in our history of colonialism, apartheid, and patriarchy." So our Equality Act very, very clearly identifies patriarchy as the ultimate source of inequality for girls and women. I think my Mac is frozen. I hope you can all still see me. Okay, my Mac is just gone and frozen. Can you hear me?
We can. You haven't frozen,
Okay.
Dale.
Okay, thank you. My screen is frozen. Okay, so now that I've given you that overview, let me just bring it back then to the project. So I was hired essentially to manage a project called the Disrupting Patriarchy Project. And it was an AWDF funded project. And that is really relevant because they are at the moment one of the leading feminist funds on the continent. And they are funding extremely interesting media work specifically. I was lucky enough to go to Ghana and meet a lot of women working on the continent who identify as feminists, who are doing media work in various ways to dismantle patriarchy. So AWDF was the funder. There were three real goals of the project. One was the empowerment of women in the film industry. We didn't just want to make a show. We wanted to do the empowerment, both what you see on the screen and also behind the scenes. So it was very important to us. And we, in fact, that was our commitment, to hire Black women-owned production companies for the project. To ensure that we then participated in endeavors to empower the industry as well, to begin to look at the structural impediments inside of the industry. Now, many of you work in the creative industry, and it's a wonderfully diverse creative industry, but it is built on patronage. So a director chooses the people that they want to work with. So the industry in and of itself gives room for a lot of creativity because people have agency, but in that agency, choices get made that are often not in women's best interests, either in what is projected on the screen or what is happening on set. So we really wanted to start engaging the industry and people working in it on those. So that was it, the empowerment, and then the advocating for women's movements, making sure the show, what was critical for the show was that we break down what feminism is, so that there isn't this perception that, we're all these hairy-legged women, who want to rewrite the Bible and, castrate all men. I mean, that 1970s outmoded idea of feminism, we wanted to pay homage to this incredible generation of young feminists that are leading the way. So there's evidence of movement. And what patriarchy does is divide us. It says you're always fighting with each other, but we want to show the movement of feminism in South Africa on the show, but then also try to build the movements. And then the third thing was the drama. Excuse me. COVID unfortunately took us out, because just as we're about to go into production, the industry shut, the country shut. So we had to very quickly pivot. What are we going to do? We can't do a drama. It was dangerous. People were dying. So we decided to go with a talk show, but a slate of 8 feminist PSA short films that speak to it. So that was basically the AWDF project. I've got 4 minutes left. So a lot of the speakers on the program today are people who have been involved in either the PSAs or the TV show. And what we want is for them to discuss really what the nuts and bolts and the experience of this project, of then trying to produce this feminist show. I had asked the SABC to be on because they were our broadcast partner. And I was quite surprised that they let, something so radical. I mean, we were just unapologetically feminist. And they were a little bit, what does that mean? But they were really a good broadcast partner in terms of trying to find the balance. Wasn't always easy because feminism is scary. But a lot of the people on the show, so we've asked some of our younger, especially presenters, who are much more than presenters, and I use that word in inverted commas, they will speak for themselves. Tando Gumede, Nico Shikwambane, and Olu Moche. They were absolutely, part of this project was really empowering young women. It's a recognition for us that there is an entire generation and cadre of young women who are well-versed in their version of feminism that has moved feminism as a movement, and we wanted to hear from them. So what you see on the screen is the consequence of the women down the value chain, and some of those are on the panel today. We'd like to hear their experiences of that. So that's really broadly. My role on this was essentially to manage both of these productions. And Olu's role, and you'll hear from Olu later, Olu was really the feminist spine, because we were working on 2 productions really quickly, and we had to make sure that they spoke to each other. So the PSA is not contradicting the talk show, even though they're being made in 2 different separate environments. And Olu was really critical in helping us to make sure that that feminist spine ran through. So when you watch the show, it looks as if they were made in one, together, but they were actually happening separately. So yeah, I mean, I think that's just really the broad overview. Then we have got a session on the regulatory environment with the Film and Publications Board. Again, a lot of people in South Africa don't understand the role of a lot of our regulatory institutions. Why are they there? What are those numbers on? With the FBB, we'll be speaking to some of that because they are at the cold front. Lebo Ramafoka, as I said, is on, and I really hope she does make it. She sent a note to say she might be delayed, and I hope she makes it because Lebo is incredibly skilled in terms of in terms of social and behavior change communication, which you would think is really easy. Lebo is really skilled in helping you understand how it's not. She was critical to helping us with the drama. She had already left Soul City, but she was a consultant. And to end, I'll give you one little example of the challenges of social and behavior change communication. We were workshopping the script, and there's a brutal rape in this drama. And we were trying, how do we situate this rape? So what happens? And so we were all, thinking we were so smart and worked out, well, she gets a phone call and a friend says, can you come over? I need to see you. And she goes to see the friend. And on her way to see the friend, this is when the attack happens. And we were quite smug. Oh, we've got the story sewn up. And Lebo just listened. And then she said, well, what is the message you're sending? And we said, and she said, well, the message you're sending inadvertently is that you should help people. You get hurt. So we had to all go back to the drawing. And that really, I mean, it was that level of detail and attention to detail across the TV show and the PSAs. And I hope Pelisa is here because Pelisa really was. A lot of the people that work with Soul City, I think, find it very difficult working with us because our bar is very high and we keep sending people back to the drawing board just because we do have to stay within our mandate. And I think I've reached my 15 minutes. So I'm going to stop stop there. But so that really is the point of the day. We've called it a training, but we want people really to have a robust discussion, and hopefully for you to learn and begin to understand and share some of your own experiences of doing work that seeks to push the women's movement wherever you are, but especially in South Africa. And just as a final thing, I am a journalist and I spent many years in a newsroom, and I have been very, very appreciative of the media in the 2 years that I've been at Soul City, just in the ways in which they have been open and receptive to feminist messages and feminists wanting to put across feminist messaging. I certainly seen a shift in that from when I was actively working in the newsroom, when it was really hard to get feminist messages into actual media, mainstream media. So with that, I'm going to stop. I'm happy to take questions, but really the day is for the panelists. So thank you very much, Paula.
Thank you very much, Gail. Don't go away. I'm going to ask the team to spotlight myself and Gail and Joan while we take some questions from everyone. Please feel free to put questions into the Q&A. I am trying to keep an eye on the chat, but I might miss them if they are there. And so if we could spotlight Joan as well, because my first question actually is for Joan. And I really wanted to ask you, how critical were partnerships in this program? What role did partnerships play, and what role can partnerships play in feminist programs like this?
Thank you very much, Paula. Just to reemphasize that the main kind of objective of the PFP program is to ensure that the multi-stakeholder partners begin to work together to make sure that we strengthen the partnership that is there, especially within the different sectors. I mean, we know that in working around the topic of gender-based violence, everybody needs to play a role. So we believe that by bringing in government, civil society, as well as the private sector now through the media, we begin to make sure that there is some kind of open conversations, and also making sure that we hold each other accountable. So for us, the whole flagship in itself, or the project in itself, has really been rooted around building multi-stakeholder partnerships and bringing everybody together. For instance, the project in itself, there's an advisory group that has been formed within the program, and with really the main aim of steering the work, but also bringing everybody in the same room to begin talking around this, making sure that we all take ownership on the challenge that is there, and we come up with a solution that would help us address this challenge together. So I think the media flagship in itself has really shown that there is power in multi-stakeholder collaboration. And I think everybody who's been part of the process of the program can really attest to that. Through the power of collaboration, through us coming together, it has really brought about some kind of a positive change. And I wouldn't want to speak more around the project itself, because we have Lutolo here, who I don't want to also take some of the things or most of the stuff that she's going to be elaborating now on. So I think just in short, that for us, we believe in the power of multi-stakeholder collaboration, multi-stakeholder partnership, and that is what the media flagship has really tried to address. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Lukolo is going to speak on the next panel. Actually, she's going to be talking about the Step Up project, its objectives, its components, its milestones so far. So we'll get more detail on that later on. But we do actually have a comment in the chat from Caesar Soga Masiwa, who is from the Eastern Cape Amatole District Municipality. And Caesar is saying that an outreach program with stakeholder partnerships, would be really very welcome in her region. And so I'm wondering whether if people on today's session are really interested in being part of a bigger partnership, a bigger movement towards feminist communication and storytelling, how they would be able to actually engage with you on that, or where they should be going in order to engage with Soul City on that partnership. I don't know if you want to answer now, or if you want to put it into the chat so that people can have access to it, but I think that would be really useful. Do you want to comment on that now, Gail?
Yeah, I mean, Soul City does work in all 9 provinces. We might not be working in the district that she's in, but we do have a provincial coordinator, and Soul City, you know, I mean, we really do get around. You know, we're a small organization. We can't, I used to work at the Human Rights Commission, which covered the whole country. So I understand the difficulties of covering 9 provinces, especially hard to reach. So we work in specific districts. And certainly, I mean, my contact details are available on the website. I can certainly put you in touch with the head of programs, and you can see where, you know, where we're working. If we're not working in the same district, I'm sure it would be possible to do that, because I think that's one of the things I should have said, really, that media and feminism are both collaborative endeavors. No one person makes a film. No one person makes a television show. No one person moves a movement. And so for us, it's that, you know, the fact that they are so similar in their approaches. The media is collaborative, and so is feminism. It's a really collaborative effort. So we would be open to that, and just get in touch with us through our website, and we can definitely put people in touch with our Eastern Cape. We know the Eastern Cape is a difficult province just because it's got really difficult to reach areas, but we'd be happy to speak to them.
Thank you, Gail, for that. And really, in terms of movement building, feminist movement building, my next question is for John, because very often I think people who are working in social behavior change, communication, recognize that it's a long-term endeavor, right? I mean, it is not, you have a meeting, you have an outcome, you have an impact. It is, you have a meeting, you have a program, you have, you know, and you have, and you have, and you have. So, John, my question is for you, and I suppose what I'm looking for is certainly for those of us who are starting out, who have who are following in many ways in the groundwork that you've laid. Can you give us a sense from the 2 decades that you've been doing this work, and not to even speak around step it up specifically, but just in the 2 decades that you've been doing this work, are you seeing progress in the movement?
Thanks, Paula. You now make me think way back to my days when I was also still working for other NGOs, also within government. You speak about behavioral change and changing norms and behavior. It's not easy. We know that when we speak about prevention, it's something that you really cannot see or taste and all that. It's really around shifting the mindset. And we've been working in the sector for quite some time, and I might say there has been some shift there and there, but then without really saying we have really made an impact or we've really made a change. We've seen that through the power of people or communities taking charge, communities taking action, we realize that also in terms of making sure that government is also held accountable. I would want to speak about the process that happened in 2019, 2020, that led to the NSP, the National Strategic Plan, that was led by the president, that it really happened through the power of people really pushing and saying to government, now enough is enough. So what we need to do in our little corners is to really start pushing and making sure that everybody, every corner, everyone takes responsibility. And we continue to say prevention should also be prioritized. So each community, we need to make sure that our interventions start early. We don't have to wait for something to happen for us to now to begin take action. So as communities, as households, all of us, I think we're speaking now of some kind of a whole society approach where everybody should be taking charge. One of the interventions that we are doing also within GIZ as part of the PFP program is to work with partners at local level. We do work in the Eastern Cape. There's a program that we have introduced there that really works with young people. We target learners in schools where they also need to take responsibility to take charge. We also believe that parenting programs are key. So we have already seen now that there's quite a number of prevention programs that targets parents, early childhood development that has been initiated. we need to begin. We also need, I think one challenge for us is to make sure that we strengthen the role of civil society, because we know that civil society is really doing a lot of work. And, you know, in terms of civil society funding, there's quite a challenge around that. So we might find that some of those civil society organizations that are really doing extremely good work, they also stop working because of the issue around funding and all that. So I think through the different small interventions that are happening within government now as part of the implementation of the NSP, there is an NSP collaborative that has been put together that really focuses on bringing together civil society organizations to speak in one voice, to begin to drive the implementation of the National Strategic Plan on Gender-Based Violence and Femicide. Yeah. So for me, in short, I think it would say we are not there yet, but there is light at the end of the tunnel, but it will only happen if everybody takes charge, if we begin to hold each other accountable, beginning with government, civil society, the private sector also playing a key role in bringing about change. Thank you.
Thank you, Joan. And for both of you, we have a participant from the Democratic Republic of Congo who's asking, what is the impact of your program, especially in countries where you're implementing it? And are you also thinking of moving beyond South Africa into other African countries like the DRC, where they are joining from? So, Joan or and.
Well, I mean, the show is on YouTube, so it's available. We only have 4, fighting with the SABC for the rest. But, you know, I mean, Soul City, you know, because we live in a global world, Soul City collaborates across the region. The AWDF grant, really, all the grantees are from across the region. And so we had constant engagement with people in other regions throughout, because they provide training. I went to Ghana. We did real workshops on a common understanding as African women, because feminism is fashionable. Beyonce is a feminist now. Everybody's a feminist now. So we really had to say, well, what does feminism mean? Because, you know, and that was for me very, very, I think I would advise everyone to go to AWDF's website and download the Charter of African Feminists. It is an incredible document that articulates what feminism is from an African perspective, which is basically we are trying to dismantle patriarchy. And feminists across the region, women, workers have always been doing that, whether they call themselves feminist or not, and they're doing it in media as well. So one, I would say that, you know, the regional and the continental thing is very important for us. All the women I spoke to in Ghana wanted a starring role on the Soul City drama, because they had grown up with Soul City in their various countries. So because we now live in a global universe and, you know, borders and boundaries are so porous, we are very open to partnerships. We partner with a range of organizations in the region and on the continent. And I think that what we all share as African women is that we are all, you know, oppressed by a common enemy, patriarchy, in many, many different manifestations. So I would once just say, please do go to AWDF, because I think what they also do, which is important for us, is they do articulate very clearly not only what feminism is, what intersectionality is, but also what feminist leadership is. And I think that for me was really, really critical in managing this project, because I had a template to hold myself accountable and then the women working on the project, because ultimately this is about power. And women, even when they have power, often behave like patriarchal men. So AWDF, in my opinion, working with feminists from around, the most credible feminists around, in drawing up this charter, give us all a guiding document for the kind of work that we can do and how we hold ourselves accountable, especially in the area of media production and intellectual property, that one of the tenets of it is you don't steal another woman's intellectual property, that you recognize another woman's labor, whether it is labor that is productive in terms of agriculture or intellectual property. And so for us, that was we had to be very careful to make sure that we acknowledge and recognize women and their contributions as part of this process, and ensure that women, where they have power, manage their power properly. Obviously, we can't be everywhere, but when you work for Soul City, those are things you have to be cognizant of.
Thank you. Joan, do you want to add to that in terms of regional impact?
Yeah, just to say, in my presentation, I did indicate that we currently work in 4 countries, in Zambia, in Lesotho, in Zimbabwe, as well as in South Africa. And we also now also working very closely with the SADC region, especially the gender unit within SADC. And I think one of the reasons we're doing that is to also expand our reach. In our next phase of the program, we'll also be expanding to Namibia, and also strengthening our work within the region. So we will have a continued exchange platforms that really brings all the stakeholders together. We started that also last year. This year, we also had an exchange together with the Ford Foundation and SADC region. So it's really making sure that we reach everybody within the region, but also making sure that the different flagships that we are implementing as the PFP program can really be upscaled and also benefit other within partners in other countries. So sure, that is a showcase. We will do that. We are expanding. If there is interest and all that, I think through Soul City, partners can also reach out to us. We'll be able to direct you in terms of what other resources are there within PFP. We also have a website where we can information can also be accessed. But starting from next year, we will be embedded within SADC region, within the gender unit, to support in making sure that the work within the region is also expanded. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We've got 2 media questions now. The first is from Mohali Mojela from Health E-News, who's asking what kind of work is being done in rural areas with this program in terms of empowering women in those parts of the world. And then the second one comes from media worker Morongwa, who's making a really valid point, and that is about the issue of sources. When journalists are quoting sources, and in this particular case, they're citing when journalists are quoting the police around incidents of rape, that the police themselves might often relay a message that tends that women should avoid going out at night, should avoid being alone at night, and actually kind of reinforce those tropes. What can media do to also change? I mean, if we're being told that, what can we do to kind of change the reporting around that? So, to both of you, who'd like to answer those 2 questions?
I'll go to the one of sources, because I mean, for me, that as a working journalist, that was my daily thing. I think that for me, the responsibility starts with you as a journalist. I think ultimately you need to understand understand your own socialization, because we are born into society that socializes us. So you need to, just as we had to realize one day, oh, apartheid's a system, it's a structure. Oh, it's not just nasty white people, it's actually a structure. Just as you begin to realize this is actually a structure, so you as an individual need to understand gender as a similar structure. Gender is as structured as industrial capitalism. It's exactly the same, and you need to understand it. So as a working journalist, if a policeman does give you a sexist answer, in my opinion, and this was my approach, it's your job to challenge the sexism, to in that moment say, no, but what do you mean? Can you explain it? And more importantly, Paula, as you know, as a journalist, you never ask a question you don't know the answer to. So, I mean, I think it also speaks to the issue of training of journalists in terms of the old school rules that applied when certainly when I was working, 3-source verification. You don't always have to find 3 men sources. There are women in this country with skills beyond. They're all 6 degrees of separation away. Find a knowledgeable woman. Don't use the quote of the policeman. And that's really the thing, why we have ongoing sexism in the media. It's so much easier to use a term like, oh, she's a single mother, or she was desperate to be married, rather than think it through as a journalist and say, well, this doesn't work. And then to challenge in the newsroom. And again, just a very brief anecdote. I once wrote a story about Maria Ramos. And in the same story, I was writing about Trevor Manuel. And I wrote my story. I went home. When I opened the newspaper, some sub had changed Trevor Manuel. I had said Maria Ramos, CEO of APSA. And some sub had said Trevor Manuel and his wife, Maria Ramos, were also in attendance. Well, I went mad. I went mad in the postmortem. I did. And I think that's what's expected. It's difficult being the only woman or feminist in the newsroom, and unfortunately, women still have to pick up the slack. But for me, it's your job as a journalist to hold not only power accountable, but your sources accountable. And there are incredible women's sources in this country that you can use, as opposed to a cop who's going to give you some reactionary, oh, well, she asked for it kind of answer.
I'm going to take one last question and then we're going to move on because I'm trying to create a bit more space for the next panel. But just to say to Joseph, who's asking why we don't have translation in French for the conference, because there are many people who would benefit. But we absolutely agree with you, and we do apologize for those of you who are listening to the conference in your second language, your third language, for some of you, there's even your fourth language, and we agree with you that there is great value in having a multiple translation, simultaneous translation for a conference like this, and we will certainly think of it again if we have an opportunity to set up. This is a critical discussion. It's a critical discussion not just for the continent, but global, for the global south, for globally, in fact. And so we see we've noted your contribution on language translation, and unfortunately for this one we weren't able to secure that. The last question for this session is from Nompilo Gwala, who's asking, do you think that the current feminist protests fulfill their advocacy role on women's rights and social awareness? And I suppose for me the question is, what could we be doing, what should we be doing better as feminists?
I'll let Joan go first because I have a tendency to dominate. Joan?
Okay, I was going to say, I think Gail would be the right person to really respond to that. But for me, it's really that we need to continue with the fight. We need to continue pressing on and pushing on. So, and I think Gail did indicate that it starts with the self. So as a woman, as a young woman, you also need to tell yourself that this is what you are going to fight for, and this is what this is what you're willing to do to ensure that the voice of women or young girls are actually being heard. So for me, it's really that we shouldn't stop what we're doing. So we need to continue doing what we do. I think we are on the right track.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, advocacy is very important. And I think that just to answer the question, our country, the constitutional framework of our country is that our Constitutional Bill of Rights has both horizontal and vertical application. So our Constitution does not just expect the government to ensure equality, it expects us. So we are expected, and it's not just citizens, if you are in the Republic of South Africa, you are enjoined by our legal framework and our highest law that if you see someone who is vulnerable and in need of their rights protected, our Constitution makes room for you to advocate on behalf of another person. You don't have to, obviously you're not going to without consent, but we have had many cases in this country at the Constitutional Court level where an individual has witnessed something happening to someone who's not them and complained and got thing. So I think that's really important. The other thing is also just we must be very wary of the demonization of feminism. Now, much as we've made progress, we're in a backlash era, and patriarchy is very smart. The right is always smart. Every move we make, patriarchy is 3 steps ahead of us. So we do need to be very, very aware of the fact that patriarchy like white supremacy, is a system with tenacious power. and it has the power to infiltrate our movements. So I think one of the most important things is just to recognize that not every woman is a feminist, and that as the media, we must stop treating disagreements between women as a catfight. We can disagree, and it doesn't mean our movement is weak. We can disagree, and it doesn't mean we can't get on with one another. And we must stop saying, oh, women are the worst. We sell ourselves short. It's not women that are the worst. It's patriarchy that is the worst. And patriarchy pits women against each other. So when we are fighting, we must definitely stop and say, where's patriarchy today? I think that advocacy is important. It's very important that we advocate for people that don't look like us. So it's not just important for me to advocate for the rights of Black women who look like me, but to even defend the rights of some unreconstructed granny in Orania, because that's what our Constitution expects. It expects that we all make reasonable accommodation for the other, and the other that is as other as us because of our past. So I think that feminism really simply is the tide that lifts all boats. Gender equality is the tide that lifts all boats because everybody benefits from gender equality.
Thank you very, very much, Gail. Thank you very much, Joan, for kicking off today's session with such powerful insights. The African Women's Development Fund African Feminist Charter, the link to it is in the chat. Please do have a look at it. Huge shout out from us for the AWDF that really kind of supports feminist programming across the continent and in the Middle East. So really go to that link and have a look. Java Beloy has also noted that the Commission for Gender Equality has developed a gender terminology project in all 11 languages. Java, I'm going to ask you to please put the link in the chat and make it available to all participants so that we are in fact able to download it today. We want today to be as practical as possible, and for that reason we're closing off this opening session and moving into action. Our next, our first panel for the day, in fact, is going to be looking at the action that we need to take, or the action that we can take around gender and media, and has three speakers that are going to be sharing their insights and their experiences. Our first speaker in today's panel is Lukolo Matomela, who is an highly experienced, she's currently the technical advisor for GIZ, seconded to the UN Women's Step It Up for Gender Equality in South African Media Project. She's a highly experienced communicator with extensive experience also as a radio producer and as a television producer. Our second speaker will be Laurie Less, who is the Film and Public Communication Board Shared Services Executive. She is currently employed by the board, which is the content regulator and agency of the Department of Communications and Digital Technologies. She was previously employed as the executive manager at Wits University Clear AA, a specialist M&E center with various government agencies. She's got over 15 years as an executive with leadership roles in a number of highly complex organizations, and really coming to share with us today the kind of work that they are doing at the Film and Publications Board, with particularly critical focus on areas of work that concern women and children and gender equality. Advocate Zanele Mtembu is an admitted advocate of the High Court of South Africa. She is our third speaker on this panel. She's the board chairperson of the Sisters Working in Film and Television, SWIFT, and she is CEO of the Justice and Equity brand called Advocate Tando Gumedi ZA, South Africa, through which she does global feminist education, speaking, transformation, and consulting. She is the founder of an international award-winning feminist technology called Mteto search engine, which uses AI and big data to prevent and respond to incidences of school-related gender-based violence amongst children and youth around the world. And so without further ado, let me hand over to Nkolo to take us through the Step It Up program, its objectives, what it did, how it operated, and what its impact has been. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Paula, and good morning to everyone. Thank you so much to Soul City for creating this robust event. I think it's been an interesting kickoff so far, and I think that these kinds of interventions are beyond necessary. As it was said up top, I am Luxolo Matomela. I'm the technical advisor for the UN Women GIZ Step It Up for Gender Equality in South African Media project. The premise of this project was alluded to by Joan up top. If we take it to be true that violence emanates from deeply held norms, stereotypes, beliefs, intrinsic in our brain, then we know that media and the creative industries play a highly influential role in terms of us thinking about ourselves, who we are. These narratives, these stories influence us from a very young age, from being a little child being told fairy tales where perpetually the woman is slightly more passive, waiting for a dashing prince to come along. What kind of, role play does that already start framing our minds about the society and about ourselves? So if we take that to be true, we decided to then sit and think, how do we engage media to be active change drivers? Traditionally, what tended to happen is that when gender prevention efforts and media would come together, it's around social marketing campaigns. So people would run an awareness campaign with media houses that would run for a certain amount of time. And actually, evidence has shown that this is not necessarily effective in and of itself and can be sometimes fleeting and sporadic. So at Step It Up, we thought, how do we engage media holistically for a sustainable period of time to achieve behavior change? So to actually motivate the media to become active stakeholders, not in a once-off campaign, but in the everyday way in which they execute storytelling, in which they execute the images and everything we consume on media platforms. The first step was to convene an advisory group. This idea of a multi-stakeholder partnership, again, was very important to us. I'm happy to say that Laurie, who's on the panel with me, Zanele, Soul City itself, Gender Links, who'll be speaking afterwards, are some of the members of the advisory group. And it really spans from civil society players to government players to the industry itself to get us all to sit down and start really interrogating what some of the challenges and opportunities are in order to make media and creative industries active change drivers. Following this, we knew that the next step had to be research. Research is an incredibly critical component of the Step It Up project, because the idea is that in order for us to know what intervention and what programmatic initiatives we can promote, we need to understand the lay of the land. And it was kicked off by a huge media monitoring research project conducted by Gender Links, which looked at 600 hours of programming across 5 television of the biggest television stations in South Africa. Huge monitoring exercise. Unfortunately, I won't be able to go into the deep details of the findings, but just to give a rough overview, and I will share all of this research material in chat, is that it was found that women are heard much less than men. So women are only 39% of news sources. This becomes even more alarming when you look at commentary on politics and economics. Women only commented on that in terms of 17%. So it means we're living in a world where men are explaining issues of national importance to us. What does that mean for audiences at home? What does that mean for our understanding? Stereotyping was still rife, and stories seldom held information on where to get help. And So we use this media monitoring research to then go back to everyone and say, look, here are the findings. What's going on here? How can we intervene? Where does help need in order to kind of change this rather gloomy picture we're seeing of where we are? We followed up this research with another piece of research looking at towards gender-sensitive storytelling and entertainment media. This was actually quite a hard qualitative research, because the idea was, if we found out that stereotyping is still rife, we want to unpack, well, why is that? What is happening specifically in the entertainment field where stereotyping is seen to be so rife? And it was a hard piece of research, because it's hard to pin down the power of patriarchy, because it influences so much and purports itself to be invisible. And it is our job to make that invisible power more visible. And so some of the findings there was that there was not enough conversation going on between broadcast channel and script writers. There was not enough conversation going on between audience reception and in terms of what people think people want to hear. There was a general kind of apprehension and fear around rocking the boat too much in terms of breaking and unstereotyping content. And so all these various research projects that we did, to mention a few, gave us an idea in a way to steer the interventions. And one of those has been creating platforms for consultation and exchange, such as these. Joan spoke about the conference we had and ongoing consultations. And another important wing then became capacity building. We are currently with GenderLinks finalizing gender sensitivity training manual. It's a very comprehensive manual for news and entertainment media that is going to take a very kind of long period of time, where we visit different stakeholders, GCIS, SABC News, community radio stations, and train them on becoming more gender aware in terms of the content that they produce. And this manual has many different fields that I can't go into now, including language, who you quote, how you write, how you angle. And this is not just stories on gender-based violence. How do you keep the gender lens on throughout the entire architecture of your storytelling? Ms. Zanele Mthembu is also going to be talking about our Safety Contact project, which is a project looking at behind the scenes on production houses, having a safety contact person to be there to act as someone where complaints of sexual harassment or any kind of gender discrimination can have a portal, because it was found that there's quite a lack, specifically in the entertainment media, in terms of an accountability measure for people to report any kinds of assaults, discrimination that happens behind the scenes. These are some examples of the capacity building measures that we are doing. And lastly, we are also embarking on voluntary commitment. We have a statement of commitment, which we produced together with all our stakeholders. And it was workshopped, quite vigorous discussions around what is practically possible for us to give to the media to commit to in order for them to be active change drivers. There are three main points of commitment in the statement of commitment. The first one is around gender sensitive reporting, including commitments around language, voices, and coverage in the media. The previous question that came around whether or not to quote a sexist police officer. So in terms of the gender sensitive reporting, not only would you not only challenge that police officer, but once you've gone through the kinds of trainings and the understandings of language and framing, you would also realize that reporting on GBV has been confined to the court, simply reporting on when someone is appearing in court, when that is happening. And that is a very limited form of reporting on gender-based violence, especially if we understand the nature of the crime. So gender-sensitive reporting is also being able to expand outside of the courtroom, speaking about the structural drivers of GBV, speaking about all the other everyday influences that go into gender-based violence outside of simply court reporting. Commitments around unstereotyping entertainment and storytelling, writing, producing, what we commission. How do we make sure that we commission stories that positively affect norms and challenge stereotypes of gender, masculinity, and relationships? And of course, creating a safe and equal space behind the scenes. So far, we are happy to report that in terms of the milestones, we have had all 19 of the SABC radio stations commit to the Statement of Commitment. Channel Africa, the entire GCIS, the Government Communication and Information System, notable production houses like Carol Bauer Productions and Tedze Productions have signed up to the statement. In terms of individual practitioners, 172 individual practitioners have signed up to the statement, and I will be putting more information about the Statement of Commitment in chat. With pledges, this is where I'll end. With pledges, it's always you pledge and then what? But we have decided to house the Statement of Commitment with our key partner, the Commission of Gender Equality. And the idea is for the CGE to then act as a watchdog. If you know that somebody has signed up to this commitment and is not living up to them, so too you can channel some of your complaints to say, look, they signed up to this, but I saw a media report that named a survivor against their will, that re-traumatized, that victim blamed. And so there can be a sense of accountability to it. And the idea is, while we're galvanizing support for people to sign the Statement of Commitment, is to do the gender sensitivity trainings, is to do the capacity building so that institutions are able to live up to the commitments that we make. At the heart of Step It Up, it's this idea that let's stop and think and interrogate every single word, every single angle, every single image we portray to say, am I reinforcing patriarchy here? Am I being self-reflective? Am I being really cognizant of the kind of story I'm telling and who it is I'm quoting and how it is I'm framing? Thank you.
Thank you so much. And we will come back with some questions later on. But I want to move now to Laurie, Laurie Les, who from the Film and Publications Board, who's going to give us an overview of their research, particularly around critical issues of concern for women and children and gender equality. So Laurie, over to you.
I'm going to try and share. Do I have rights to share the presentation from my side?
You should, Laurie. Yeah.
Great stuff. Let me know if you can see it.
All good. We can see it. You can full screen if you want.
I'm trying to do that. It's not. There we go. Good. All right, so thanks for the introduction. What I want to do right now is to actually give you a taste of what we do just for 2 minutes at the Film and Publication Board. Let me know if you can see.
Yep, we can see.
Still the first slide.
Can you see that?
Slide hasn't moved, Laurie. It's still just your title slide.
All right. All right. It's unfortunate. I was going to show you a 2-minute video on racism.
Try again. Try again. Just try again.
It's okay. It's okay. It's not going to work. I have tried. Let me see. I'll try again.
We can also share the link in the chat, and so people will be able to go back and have a look at it afterwards.
I think that will save time and effort, isn't it?
Agreed, Laurie.
Great stuff. Thank you. Good. So this was a 2-minute excerpt of a movie that we use when we classify. So we're the regulatory board. I'm not going to go into too much detail because my very good colleague is here with me today, Lynette, and she is going to assist and take you through who we are and what we do. So the 2-minute video basically assists you to understand how powerful media is. And as a critique to that piece, which was the 2004 Oscar-winning film called Crash, created, directed by a white male. But it tells the story of racism through his eyes. And critical to note is that as much as it raises social awareness and racial awareness, it demands a lot of introspection for us as classifiers at the Film and Publication Board as to like context. For us, context is critical when we apply an age rating. This is a white male. It is told through his eyes. It is largely for a US white audience, and it is told about systematic racism in a white hegemonic culture, as certainly it could be, because that's his audience, and at the end of the day, that's your paying audience. Ultimately, as well, taking into consideration that the film was a catalyst when he was carjacked. So that was just as an entry point for my rest of my presentation and something to chew on. The internet has no firewall for patriarchy. And this is something, it's a statement that was coined by my colleague. We refer to him as a male feminist, Opa Machalameli. So let me take you through the mandate of the organization very briefly. As I said, Lynette is going to talk to you all about it. We, through the recent review of our regulations, we have criminalized child pornography, as well as what we call revenge pornography and also user-generated content. In other words, when you sit with your cell phone and you send a picture or a naked picture of yourself, and some third party passes it on without your permission. We also provide consumer advice. We do a lot of work around the protection of children. And so why do we regulate? For me, there are two critical reasons. It's having due regard to our past, where information was censored, and we enforced conformity to the then governmental theories. And there was no freedom of expression. And secondly, for me, very important is the balancing act, the balancing of freedom of expression, the right of freedom of expression, with also the right of your individual beliefs, etc. And so this leads us to why is it that we do our convergence surveys every 2 years? So one of the critical elements I thought for today, I just wanted to focus in and hone in on this. We have a number of what we call classifiable elements. So when you watch a movie, you will come across the little triangle. I think it's on my screen up top there. And then below that or next to it, we'll have, for example, PG, etc., or XX or X18. And those would denote the classifiable rating. So I want to talk a little bit about prejudice and hate speech. So there's a lot of work, and we do training with our classifiers on hate speech. I actually cannot even see my header here, sorry. And gender-based, what is this? Ooh, I cannot see this. I cannot see my header, sorry guys. And it's prejudice and hate speech as it relates to sexual orientation. For example, the movie The American Preacher. And I think Gail earlier mentioned exactly, we use exactly the IGC definition that Gail spoke to, which is group identification by race, sexual orientation, gender, sex, pregnancy, marital status, and I can go on, and the list is not exhaustive. And then in terms of hate speech, what I thought I would just remind all of us, and I'm certainly not reading this, is the issue of Malema's tweets about journalists that happened not in the too far away or in the distant past. And as you know, the journalists or the complainants came together and took him on and took the matter to the Constitutional Court. However, the court judgment ruled that the complainants have failed to establish that being a journalist qualifies them for both the protection under Section 10 and 11 of the Equality Act, and on and on. They also held that the EFF was not responsible for third-party tweets. In other words, what we call trolls. And so the Film and Publication Board, in the work that we do, also pays attention, a lot of attention to that particular space, which is the online space. There's a lot that we're not doing. There's still a lot of area and space for the actual owners of the platforms to play their role, and I'll touch on that in a few slides later. So let me talk about the actual research piece that we do every 2 years. It's the overview of what we call the convergence survey. Why do we test convergence? Because we want to assess whether our age ratings are in alignment to broader societal norms, values, and standards. So, for example, you may all remember the whole uproar, most of you, sorry, when there was a release of a movie, a local movie called Ingleba, which loosely translated means the wound. And it is a story told of a homosexual relationship that takes place in a very secretive, highly regarded traditional practice of circumcision. Naturally, the whole country was up in arms. And naturally, the Film and Publication Board had a very important role to play in assessing whether, in fact, we had to test then whether, in fact, the application of the classification rating to the movie was in keeping with the broader societal views. This matter went to the appeal court and even higher, and it raised certainly our internal awareness as well, in terms of what we put out there and the decision-making processes for us internally. So we employ a group of 40-odd classifiers. These are independent consultants, and they hail from a very broad, eclectic group of differences and people who are age different, race, gender, their backgrounds. So it's a real multicultural melting pot of classifiers who come together, and they sit, they watch movies, they play games, and they assess the content. So why then the classification or the convergence survey? We want to assess harm and its appropriateness, and classifiers are duty-bound to apply the test of tolerance and not their personal taste. The community standard test, and this is, I'm quoting from the Canadian regulator, is that the standard of the community as a whole, which must be considered, and not the standard of a small segment or an individual of the community. And that's exactly what we do. We actually mirror that. So the litmus test for us in South Africa is whether the content is beyond society's tolerance level in terms of the potential harm to children in a particular age group based on their stage of development and their limited experiential knowledge, when the content is judged within context. Reasonable grounds that exist in reaching the conclusion that a restrictive age rating is appropriate. And this would have applied, for example, to the restrictions that society wanted us to place on this film called Ingleba. And then we also test the disapproval or no disapproval, where it promotes, condones, or perpetuates prejudices and negative stereotypes. And I think specifically for this group today is that we look at prejudice when you see the P as an advisory, as a consumer advisory, and then we also look at V for violence. And it's been a big debate in the organization, and we say that we actually cover gender-based violence in 2 or 3 different sectors of our classification ratings. And so even as an organization, I can pass critique and say to you that we don't. When we were doing some research a year ago, and I asked my classifiers, could you pull out the number of incidences of gender-based violence in media content? And we were unable to do so because the organization has reached a consensus view that GBV falls under the broader umbrella of violence. Okay, so it's one of the things that I think, and my colleague is Yelenet, I certainly think that we should lobby with society to raise it, to mainstream it, to bring it out into the fore. Otherwise, it will be lost. And so it's very difficult for me from my research that to pull out some of those statistics and to say to you, I can tell you safely that there's a high incidence of violence in the content that is brought into the country and that is produced in the country. I can tell you that there is quite a high number of sexual violence incidences, because that's what we call it. But embedded within sexual violence is not just GBV. It's a range of other elements as well. So it's very difficult for us. And I think
2 minutes, Laurie. Sorry, 2 minutes.
Okay, thank you. So we've done a root cause analysis, and I'm not going to go into the detail. I'm going to skip through it. This is available. I just wanted to show you the bottom line here in the Convergence survey was that the majority of South Africans knew the organization. The sad thing is that there's a very high tolerance, almost what we call desensitization in the country to violent content. So respondents basically said that we would rather watch violent content and allow our kids to watch violent content than to watch sexual kissing, for example. We also cover the area of games. And then there's a partner research project with the Bureau for Market Research, and this looks at online child sexual exploitation that we are busy with. And we'll be testing the viewing of online pornographic material amongst children in South Africa. So there's quite a high incidence of children who access pornography. And then just a day ago, 2 days ago, this was a presentation that my department, which is the Department of Communications and Digital Technologies, had a service provider, Pigma, to look at the impact of digital media in misinformation and content moderation. Again, this is made available for you. But basically, we're saying that digital media has certainly transformed the way we create and distribute information. Some statistics on social media penetration, it's quite high. There are 25 million users, and guess what? Most of those people have 2 to 3 telephones. There's a need to understand the digital content value chain. And in that value chain, where do we fit as the regulator? Last but not least, I thought I would put the slide together because this was some of the content or the intent and the outcome for this day's session was to look at what are the structural impediments of women for women in media and entertainment, which is our speciality. And one is the proliferation of stereotypical gendered roles, specifically women in film. There should be clear guidelines on hate speech and prejudice, which we do have. Then there's an increase of GBV in film and other content. Again, this is because it falls under the category of the 3 categories I mentioned earlier: violence, sexual violence, and prejudice. And there is a definite sense through our research of community desensitization to GBV and that kind of content, the content that stereotypes women. Then we should be looking at toxic hypermasculinity. Cyber misogyny is on the rise. The protection of children from pedophilia. Pedophiles targeting younger children, our research shows, between 3 and 13, where before they were targeting up to 16 years. And the reason for that is all our outreach work, it's paying off. Our older kids at high schools, etc., where we were targeting our outreach, are wise these days. So pedophiles are even smarter. They know about this, and so they're targeting younger kids. And then the last but not least is access. It's still a largely male-dominated space. And my colleague Lucolo mentioned the very important study that they did with gender links. Then online tools and apps that women, and specifically marginalized women because of data costs and digital infrastructure in rural and peri-urban areas, women still do not access. And then access to funding for content creators. More pitching sessions should be encouraged. I thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Laurie. And sorry that we had to rush you there.
No
That
problem.
was really, really comprehensive. But I do want to move on now to media executive Zanele Mtembu, who is the board chairperson of Sisters Working in Film and Television, and who's the board chairperson of Sisters Working in Film and Television, SWIFT. And SWIFT also has extensive research on gender and women in film and is going to share that with us, as well as some of the initiatives that have been introduced in order to, as safeguards on set. So if I could hand over to you, Sanele.
Thank you for having us on this platform. And just to have the opportunity to hear also what other organizations are doing and where we can possibly have partnerships in the work that SWIFT is doing. So just as a bit of background, SWIFT was started in 2016, so it's still a relatively new organization that really looks at what the concerns and interests of women are in this industry. And in order for SWIFT to prioritize its work, we conducted research, which was funded by the National Film and Video Foundation. And the study itself was called Gender Matters in the Audiovisual Sector. And I will share the link later on, specifically on that. I would like to spend a bit of time today. So I'll speak briefly about the research itself, but move on quickly to the work that we have now started, which looks at recourse on what women can do, or anyone that is sexually, the vulnerable that are sexually harassed, and and where they can go to report. So the study on Gender Matters really assisted SWIFT to focus its work and prioritize areas that needed attention, really, because so that we're not really all over the place. And that study, what it revealed to us primarily, apart from other things which were about issues of parity in terms of pay, the lack of equal representation of women, particularly behind the scenes and in key decision-making positions, such as heads of different departments in the film and TV sector, and issues just of, particularly the stories that are written and how they are written and how women are portrayed on screen. And the big issue that came up and showed us out of that study that about 70% of women in the industry were not feeling safe in the industry. And what that meant then was that SWIFT prioritized they were not feeling safe, because of sexual harassment in the industry, which still is quite prevalent in the industry. It doesn't matter that, women are not that it doesn't matter. Women are not being paid what they're supposed to be paid, that they are not represented, if they are not working in a safe environment. All these things then really fall away or are not as serious as they should be. We wanted first and foremost to help create an environment that is safe for women to thrive in the industry. So SWIFT then focused on advocating, or rather creating awareness about sexual harassment, educating about sexual harassment, and finding a way of dealing with sexual harassment or reporting of sexual harassment in the industry. So that's where we started. We said this is going to be our priority so that women can be able to really realize their full potential in the industry. And the education and drive that we then started to look at was first and foremost, to develop a code of good practice in handling sexual harassment that would be shared in the industry, that we encouraged everyone that works in the industry to adopt and ensure that it is signed by each and every person that works in the industry. The code so far has been, excuse me, adopted and supported by the Department of Sports, Arts and Culture, the National Film and Video Foundation, the SABC, and in some form, it has also been adopted by the Department of Trade and Industry, who offer rebates to the industry itself. And a number of production companies have now also adopted that code of good practice in the industry. So the next thing was really to look at how do we then also create this awareness about the prevalence of sexual harassment in the industry. So SWIFT developed a public service awareness, public service and awareness that were PSAs, or that we called hashtag that's not okay. And these PSAs really depicted real life situations of women, sexual harassment situations of women. And these are available on YouTube. We have flighted them at film festivals where we've partnered to show the PSAs before the screening of any film. What we also do is that we have sexual harassment impact sessions, and at these impact sessions, we show the PSAs, and then we have a presentation of what sexual harassment is and how we can work together to really address sexual harassment. We then also ran a pledge where everyone that is on a production will take the pledge to say that I will not sexually harass anyone. So this is over and above signing the code of good practice. This is the individuals saying we will not support sexual harassment. We will not personally harass anyone, and we will make sure that we report incidences of sexual harassment on sets that we're working on. So that's the work that SWIFT has been done. So the next question was, okay, now that we have created the awareness, now that we've educated people about sexual harassment, where do they go to actually report and find help when they have an incident to report, or if they just need more information about sexual harassment? And that's where the concept of the safety contact officer came about, and how it came about. We were then supported by GIZ, as well as the Department of Sports, Arts and Culture, and the Swedish Embassy to put together the project. Firstly, we had to conduct research on what the program itself, the Safety Contact Officer program, would look like, what purpose it will serve, and how then do we implement that. These are all quite detailed research reports, which I will share links to. Unfortunately, at the moment, our website is under construction, so I cannot direct you to the website, but I can share the links and the contact information so that we can be able to supply you with the research. So following the research on the safety contact officer, what we established was that these safety contact officers would be individuals that would offer support to the industry, and they had to have psychosocial training, be trained in the legal framework of dealing with sexual harassment, have some kind of knowledge around dealing with human resources. And we then went ahead and recruited 6 individuals, and these individuals were social workers. So we did not have to really focus too much on training, ordinary people without the necessary skills. But we found social workers that we trained more on the legal framework of dealing with sexual harassment, so that they can be the contact on sets to deal with cases of sexual harassment, to also conduct the sexual harassment impact sessions, where we educate people on set about what sexual harassment is, what resources are available, and how production companies can then deal with any reports on set of cases of sexual harassment. The pilot itself was launched, started in October 2020, actually. So the plan was to start earlier, and as we all know, COVID then happened, and we had to push out the implementation of the Safety Contact Officer pilot project until late in the year, last year, 2020. The research, the Safety Contact Officer pilot started October, and it went on until January this year. We placed safety contact officers on different projects, or productions rather, in the Western Cape, Gauteng, and KZN specifically, because those three areas are the hub of production in South Africa. The report itself is currently being compiled, and it will be presented to our stakeholders as well as partners in the industry, which will speak to the findings of that pilot, and what then is the way forward in terms of implementing the program to the industry, so that freelancers who do not really enjoy the protection of a human resource department by nature of being freelancers, or cannot really approach the CCMA when they have issues because they are under contract and they are not under employment contract as employees, they can then approach the safety contact officers to report incidents of sexual harassment, and they can receive help, whether that assistance is counseling, whether they are supported through a mediation process, or whether they want to take the case further beyond just mediation within the production, but outside of that. In serious incidences, for instance, of rape, the safety contact officers know exactly what to do and how to support victims of rape by taking them or accompanying them to the police station, to lay a charge, to do everything that needs to be done in order to open a case of rape. So that
Zanele, sorry,
outcome.
1 minute left.
Mm-hmm.
1 minute
Okay.
left. We're running out of time. Thanks.
Fine. Oh, I thought I was skipping so many things. Thank you so much. So that is where we are at the moment. And as I said, that the full report will be made available and will be shared, and we'll invite partners and interested parties to be part of that, so that they can know exactly the outcome and the next steps with regards to the safety contact officers. We are continuing to get receive requests from production companies, particularly to conduct the sexual harassment workshops, so that we continue to create awareness on productions about sexual harassment and how people can be assisted. But that's where we are. I mean, there's a lot with this, so I tried to skip, and I've skipped so many things just to try and summarize where we are right now. But we are really happy that there is now recourse for people that have suffered from sexual harassment and want to report those cases, so that they can be assisted.
And Swift has done incredible. And thank you very much, Zanele. I was going to say that Swift has done incredible work during a very, very difficult time. We're running slightly late, but I do want to call all three of the panelists back here, because I think the one thing that really comes across from all of your work, from what you said, Zanele, from what Laurie has said, from what from what Ollie has said, I keep on skipping between the two, is the need to really be intentional, right? To really think about what we're doing, how we're doing it, to think about what we've put in place and how we work from there. I'm going to say that we will send everyone who signed up for this workshop all of the contacts and all of the links. So if the additional links that you want to be able to send us, to please do that. But there no questions per se, but quite a lot of comments, and I want to go back to one of them just to find out. We spoke about involving certainly mainstream media in a lot of the initiatives that we are doing. I wanted to find out from all of you actually what kind of steps are being taken. Laurie, you skipped over it, but that idea that sometimes you can be very stuck in mainstream media, but in fact, a lot of audiences have shifted to other media platforms, other forms of media engagement. And so when we're talking about media productions, we are talking about people who are producing actually for YouTube. That is the platform that they're actually consuming for. And so for all of you, the work that you do, is it extending to community media? Is it extending to non-traditional media platforms? Is it extending to new media platforms? And so if you could comment on that question and perhaps wrap up your final comments. So let's start with GIZ.
Yes, we work quite extensively with community radio stations in particular. They're a huge focus area for us as Step It Up, because we understand that specifically looking at the rural-urban divide, they reach a lot of key audiences. I saw Caesar's comment there speaking about the Eastern Cape, Forte FM as long as UCRF. So we work through the WITS Radio Academy, which has a lot of networks, specifically in campus radio stations and community radio stations, as well as the MDDA. So we have a session dedicated specifically for community radio stations and the gender sensitivity trainings, CISA. So do let me know if you would like us to involve Forte FM. We'd be happy to do that, as well as WUSU. It will be free of charge. It will be open to all the community radio stations. So that's something we make a concerted effort to do. And as a huge stakeholder of ours, we've consulted extensively with community radio stations and jointly with WITS Radio Academy, GCIS, and Global Citizen last year ran a masterclass on gender sensitive reporting for community radio stations specifically. In terms of your other question, Paula, looking at non-traditional platforms, I think that's really interesting territory. I think at the moment we are very much married to broadcast. As Step It Up, just looking at the mediums that have the hugest reach in South Africa. So television and radio are kind of our bread and butter, but we are looking to, as we plan the project ahead, not only look at kind of podcasts for YouTube, look at the podcast space, look at the social media space, look at the Instagram live space. So I think that's something we're going to be expanding into. But at the moment, I would say we are pretty much married to broadcast media, and we'll be looking to expand a bit, looking at the next 3 years.
Thank you very much. Laurie, in your case, is the board actually looking beyond traditional platforms?
Sorry, I was muted, right? I want to preface what I want to say is that technology moves far faster than our ability to change the law. However, there's been a lot of changes, for example, over the top media content, specifically the massive rise during COVID, what we call online streaming and video on demand, etc., and a couple of other acronyms that I can throw at you, but what we call self-generated content. So we work very closely with the platform owners. We've last year signed an agreement, we call it co-regulation. So those of you who have Netflix, you might have seen the little triangle next to the movies, and we work very, very closely with them. So for example, on Facebook, etc., if we do get a complaint, we can speak to their community curators and have content taken down immediately with immediate effect. So yes, we do. We don't censor. We work with the platform owners. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laurie. And I just want to say to everyone, I think we might have lost Zanele, but I do want to say that if you have any questions, please put them into the Q&A, because the panelists can go into the Q&A and ask. So even if they've spoken already, if you suddenly realize you still have a question for anyone, put it into the Q&A and we will respond to it later on. I just want to double check, has Zanele fallen off?
Could I comment something while we're waiting for her?
Sure.
I just wanted to say something that our research shows that there's massive change in distribution patterns. So I think that is something, if the journalists are here and the creatives, I see a couple of them are here in the audience, it's a very interesting shift for us and for us to be monitoring as to the reduction of the number of films that are coming into the country, the increase of what we call Swahili-hood. It's a whole new concept of Swahili-based films, and then the gap in terms of content for younger children. Then the fact that you find content being self-generated makes it very difficult for us, and it's so immediate. And we talk about travelability of information. It's so immediate and it travels and trends immediately. Very difficult to regulate. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much to all three of you. Zanele has fallen off. So we're going to move from action to on screen now. Thank you very much for that great conversation, and really interesting to see what's happening behind the scenes and how all of that comes together for social and behavior change communication. But before we move on, we're just going to play another clip from It's a Feminist Thing. So if we could have a clip, please.
There is a war going on, South Africa. Declare a state of emergency. The war is undeclared, so the other side is caught off guard, unarmed. It's a war of men on women, of boys on girls. The war is denied by its perpetrators. Its soldiers parade in camouflage as loving grandfathers, fathers, uncles, brothers, and sons. The war zone is not demarcated. Like blood, dignity spills. Rape rips lives apart. Incest rips lives apart. Violence rips lives apart. The war is on, South Africa. Declare a state of emergency. The war zone is you.
Thank you. And really, really powerful PSAs coming out of the program there. We're moving to on screen now, and we have with us the three of the presenters of It's a Feminist Thing, who are really coming to share with us what it was like to share feminism on screen, and I'm really excited also about this conversation, because I think it speaks really to what it's like to be constantly having this conversation with people. So our three speakers are consummate presenters. Our first speaker will be Thando Gumede, who describes herself as and I want to get the precise wording, as legal eagle, feminist educator, speaker, innovator. Thando is a admitted advocate of the High Court of South Africa, and she's also the founder of an internationally award-winning feminist technology called Mteto search engine, which uses AI and big data to prevent and respond to incidences of school-related gender-based violence. Our second speaker, Nico, Shikamwane is a feminist activist, curator, media practitioner, and presenter on the It's a Feminist Then talk show. And our last speaker, Lesedi Olukomoche, is content and on-camera coach. She's a film festival curator. She is a creative producer, and obviously she's one of the presenters of It's a Feminist Then. I want to request that we keep our remarks to about 5-6 minutes, our opening remarks to 5-6 minutes, and then we'll be able to have some conversation afterwards. So can we start then with Tando? To tell us your experience of making feminism on screen. What was it like?
Thank you so much for inviting me into this space. I want to preface your question with an introductory answer, which is to say that, we are now in the Aquarian age, the age of disruption. And I think, first of all, Gail mentioned the issue of intersectionality. And I think I like the fact that she put in context, but I also want to say that intersectionality has to be founded upon the principles of empathy and connectedness between human beings. And as Africans, we refer to this connectedness and empathy as Ubuntu. There is now a growing global movement, and while many people haven't named it, I think it would be adequate and appropriate to name it as the global feminist Ubuntu movement, or whatever you'd like to name it as. And what this is about saying that we cannot necessarily speak of feminism and not recognize our humanity and not recognize the fact that we are all ultimately being oppressed by the same system of oppression. What patriarchy does is that and what white heteropatriarchy has done historically, is that it has convinced people that they are different, that there's no way for them to be able to converge in the same room and have anything of substance to say to one another that can relate to each other. But I think the sooner we begin to recognize and understand that we are all being oppressed by the same system of oppression, and to begin to empathize and to connect the dots, for instance, when there is an issue in Israel and Palestine or in Myanmar, and to begin to understand that, oh, hold on, but this is also patriarchy unfolding, because I've never heard the voices of women at the table of the conflict resolution issues in Israel, between Israel and Palestine, for instance. And so what we're actually seeing unfolding is a fight between men that ultimately damages those who've been historically marginalized. And so for me, being part of the show was about making a contribution to feminist unification and to the growing accord, the growing clarion call for global feminist Ubuntu. And also what I can say is that we need to collaborate and unite. And what we need to understand about the making of the show is that it wasn't just about a collaboration behind the scenes with the production companies, and it was also a collaboration and a unification of minds in front of the camera, on screen. Because what happened there is that you saw journalists, people who were involved in TV, people who were involved in the CSO, NGO space, lawyers coming together and generating content that would be not only educational value, but would be disruptive and would challenge the system of patriarchy. And because it is now online, it's not just challenging that system within South Africa, but it is also purporting to challenge it around the world.
Thank you very much, Tanda. I do have some questions for you, so we're going to come back to you, but I want to move on to our next speaker now, who also a feminist curator, media practitioner, and presenter. To make sure that she is on, Amyuka, are you there?
Yes, hi, I'm
Hi.
here. Hello to you and to my fellow panelists, everyone that has spoken before, as well as to those that are participating on the platform. Thank you so much for having me. Yes, what I can say about feminism on screen is that my journey with that, or the work that I've done into that, as a gender activist, academic researcher, as well as a media practitioner, does not really begin with it's a feminist thing, but it does begin with Soul City. Maybe 4 or 5 years ago, I think it was, maybe my maths is wrong, but 2014, 2015, with a show called Rise. It was Rise talk show for young women and girls. And there the approach was quite different to what we see on It's a Feminist Thing. We had discussions on issues that affected young women and girls, particularly looking at economic opportunities, contraceptives, rape, lobola and culture, and just how young women navigate their lives, and the choices that they have to make within different aspects of their lives. Shortly after the show, I was still a student at Wits University at the time, studying law. It was literally then 2015, right, on the brink of the Fees Must Fall student uprising. And then soon after, what we saw were young students at Wits University, at Rhodes University, at the University of Cape Town, also then using the same student protests to amplify issues that affected young women and girls, such as rape culture, particularly in the university setting. And that's where I think that a kind of disruptive feminism sort of forced its way onto the screen, onto traditional media platforms like your 24-hour news broadcasting stations, ENCA and SABC at the time, through particular techniques like the naked protest, the showing of breasts, of whips, the using of dooks and shambox, and as well as using social media and hashtags, because social media does influence what mainstream and traditional broadcasters tell stories about. And I think that's where I can say really my work began, when it comes to sort of literally putting feminism on screen. And so it wasn't from a production level in that way, but was more from a radical, like we had begun with Rise, but was more of, and from the ground to the top, sort of disruptive, robust approach to literally putting a type of feminism and a type of radicalness on screen. I could say the same thing about my involvement and my participation in the hashtag Remember Kwezi protest, where former President Jacob Zuma was giving his announcement on the 2016 elections at the IEC, where myself and 3 of my fellow colleagues, Naledi Cherwa, Simamkela Tlakavu, and Amanda Mavuso, stood in front of the president, then again trying to disrupt traditional media through literally bringing back the memory of the late Fezeka Kuzwayo, who we now know as Ukwezi, and that in that very famous rape trial against Jacob Zuma, And so when it comes to It's a Feminist Thing, and putting that feminism on screen, and then having also been involved in sort of the brainstorming and conceptualizing sort of level, and then now having the responsibility to curate and say, okay, how are we going to have a discussion about feminism in South Africa and the different types of feminist movements that are there? I mean, I've only named a few, there are many others, then the approach becomes different. The responsibility is a lot bigger, because I think the challenge for me was, how then do we archive all these processes that have happened before, the different ways in which we articulate and the different ways in which we express our feminism and the different the anger and the rage that is involved. You know, how do we give that kind of rage dignity on air and on screen? And how do we make that translatable? How do we explain concepts, since now we've been given the opportunity, like cancel culture and what women and feminists in South Africa have done on Twitter and Facebook, you know, which they now have the power to literally have someone who's being accused of gender-based violence, you know, they literally have the power to stop that person from going to work the next day or being suspended the next day. You know, how do you explain that? Because yes, the public might think that that is a bit harsh of a measure or of a response, but how do you explain that that is a kind of power that they have galvanized themselves? You know, so yes, I can say that. So feminism on screen is not necessarily something that has happened or has been given to activists or you know, those that are involved in the sector on a silver platter, but there's been a sort of like tug of war back and forth and different sort of techniques and approach. And so It's a Feminist Thing then as a show became one opportunity to say, okay, here is what it looks like when it's been curated, and here is what it's looked like when it's been done responsibly, and here is what it's looked like when we try to remember and archive and give dignity to the work that women have done in the sector. Thank you.
Thank you. That's really powerful, and I want to come back to some of the things that you've said. I think that there's just so much there that we can discuss, and so I'm expecting, or I am expecting questions for you. But I want to move on to Lesedi now, Lesedi Olukomoshe, who also is a presenter on It's a Feminist Thing, to share her introductory remarks, and then again to remind everyone, questions in the Q&A so we can answer as many of them as possible. But let's move to Lesedi and get her opening remarks. Thanks.
Hi, good morning. Thank you so much. Just as a point of clarity, so I'm not a presenter on It's a Feminist Thing. I came on as a content coach for the television show and as a creative producer for the PSAs. So my role was to translate the dense content into conversational bite-sized chunks. In terms of what I do from my experience on it, I'm not really sure how to explain how I work, except to say that I'm guided by intuition, and integrity and a personal code of ethics are rooted in, I root myself in grace and kindness. And the work that we're doing is, in terms of behavior change, I feel like it is an emotive and a spiritual calling. It's not all brain work in terms of being able to shift these things. So just a little bit of a personal note of how I work. I have my own grounding rituals that I do before entering into this type of work, because it is heavy work. So this includes lighting a candle, asking my guides to release any negative energy and to come in with luminous energy, and that I may speak and work with honesty and integrity at all times. There was a point that was raised earlier around like what is needed for this kind of work to exist. And really the first thing is that it's money. Money is needed. So I'd like to thank the organizations and the people that lead them. Your commitment and financial contributions make it possible for us to do what we do, and make it possible for this content to live in different formats, whether it's in literature and in this case, television. I've had the good fortune on this program. So as Nico spoke about Rise, I also produced Rise in conjunction with Khomotso Matsunyani, who is the executive producer. And having worked with her for many years, she really consistently brought me into these programs that she was working with Soul City. Beyond that, I think the work of the CEOs, both CEOs of Soul City, so Lebora Mafuku and Fina, with both Rise and It's a Feminist Thing, having the CEOs also come in as co-anchors becomes really important, because they sit as the custodians of the Institute, so they can ground certain parts of the content to what the Institute is and what it does. So really there's a cross-pollination on both Rise and It's a Feminist Thing. I want to take the opportunity to also just frame the show for the people that may not have watched it. So It was 48 minutes. There were 4 hosts. So it was Fina Horisan, Khomutso Matsuyani, there was Nico and Tando who are on this panel. So you've got 4 different voices that are anchoring the show. Then there was also an elders corner, which had a more intergenerational transfer of knowledge. There was the allies corner. There were inserts, and one of my favorite sections actually was the language section, which was anchored by Ponso Pilani. So she would translate feminist terms into Setswana. And she's also currently busy co-writing and creating a Setswana dictionary on feminist terms and reproductive terms and words. And then, of course, the PSAs that were done by Pelisa Norman's company as executive producers. So all these sections of the show were meant to complement and diversify the points of entry to the conversations. So really keeping the audience in mind, as well as being able to produce the content that the client, being Soul City, wanted. Now, for me, it's about translating this heavy and dense content that exists and being able to have it be digestible for audiences that are listening and not necessarily reading it. So what this requires is an understanding and respecting the capacity of the people who are vessels for the messages. So these are the hosts, because as much as they're meant to disseminate the information, they're also living in the center of trying to navigate and negotiate themselves within the system of patriarchy that exists. So a lot of this content is very triggering. We create and disseminate the content. However, my main role is to make sure that the hosts, and in some instances, the team, is mentally prepared for the weight of this content. Additionally, I'm also interested in language. A lot of feminist terms can present as exclusionary in terms of how people consume and comprehend conversations. So my role was to work on getting the host to colloquialize some of the academic phraseology. So when we speak of patriarchy and heteronormativity, these need to be distilled into absorbable and conversational words where possible, and they need to be framed and explained. So that's the other thing too, was to say, okay, this pursuit can't purely be one that is understood from people who have had the privilege of being able to enter into academic institutions. There's a day-to-day way and language and use of language that we need to be able to bring into it. So whether it's done through anecdotes or personal disclosures of experience, my interest really was in making sure that we bridge that gap that exists between the terms that we use and the people that we're speaking to. At the beginning of this call, Gail called me the feminist spine, which I find very, very generous. The team at both production companies was absolutely phenomenal. They did all the heavy lifting, to be sure. And with the exception of Khomotso and Nico, most of the people on the team were new to me. So I was brought in quite late into the process. So along with what I was hired to do, I also had to navigate trust in a very short space of time. The team had to trust me. And they had to be able in a short space of time, not just to trust me, but to be able to translate what I was sharing with them and the work that I was brought in to do, and be able to quickly translate it onto screen, because the production schedule was also very, very tight. So we're shooting 2 to 3 episodes in a day of very heavy content. So you can imagine what it is to have an episode on intimate partner violence, and then the next episode is on rape, and it's all happening within one day. In terms of the hosts, so having multiple hosts meant that my role had to be to ensure that it's not just a chorus of agreement across everyone, but that the audience can identify themselves in one or more of the hosts and their thoughts and experiences. So we also did a lot of work on making sure that each host has their personal opinion that can come out, that we're framing it within what Soul City requires from the show, and also that it's not just 4 people agreeing to each point, right? That there also is debate and negotiation of the content that's being shared. And also, I mean, living beyond theory meant that I had to also sit with the host to ensure that, you know, what are they comfortable disclosing from their personal experiences, and how do we make sure that they're safe in terms of what they're disclosing for purposes of the show. So that was my overall role. And in terms of my experience in it, I mean, I do like television and film specifically because it is more accessible and more people access it, I suppose, than like, you know, the documents that are circulated. So I'll stop there, and I look forward to any questions if there are any.
Thank you very much, Lizette. I'm going to ask that everyone, that the other well, the presenters get brought back onto screen. But Lizette, I have a question for you. A number of the people who are on today are actually print or they content creators for mainstream media, and so for me, it's that for a lot of people who are coming to today's session, it might be the first time that we're actually talking about the issues that we're raising here. And as an older feminist, I'm very aware of the way I've been socialized. I can see my sons and my daughter, who've been brought up in a stronger feminist framework, are a lot more comfortable with the terms, a lot more kind of aware of tropes, of stereotypes, of even just framing of narratives, and sometimes I'm always second guessing myself. So I guess for me the opening question for you as the content coach is that when writers or producers, creatives are producing this content, what are the kinds of questions they need to be asking themselves if they want to have a better feminist framing of their stories?
Mhm. I guess the first thing is to not kind of separate yourself from the content itself, right? So to really just center your own experiences, because we all have the experiences, and whether it's shared experiences from a mom, a friend, a sister, or even your own experience. So I think the first thing when we're doing this work, and I mean, personally, this is what I do, is that I absorb the information and then I ask myself, in which ways on a day-to-day basis have I faced this? In which ways have I responded to this, right? In which ways have I been ready or not ready to respond to whatever form of violence is being mitigated against me? So I think the primary thing is to also remember that we are still living in this world that we have to reflect and write about. And once we center ourselves in it, I think it does become a little bit easier to be able to speak authentically and to be able to speak in ways that are accessible to other people, and also understanding who your audience is. So depending on who you're writing for, right, you understand the needs of your audience. So you might be writing for an audience that is more academic and has higher levels of education, so then you use that language. You might be speaking to an audience that can only take in a small amount of content at a time. So then you figure out, how do you phrase stuff into quotable chunks that can be remembered? So yeah, I hope I've answered your question.
I think we could talk about this all day, but certainly that's really, really very, very useful. Tanda, I want to come to you because, I mean, one of the clips that went viral on social media was the clip of you speaking about us having a feminist constitution, and you actually got quite a lot of, backlash around that, and it really kind of got the Twitterati going. Can you comment about that? I mean, what was it like to be so in your face feminist and talking about feminist issues, but also specifically around that clip? Talk to us about that experience and what you learned from that experience.
Well, I mean, the clip was more than just a clip. It just captured a moment of a textual reality. The reality is that we have a constitution that protects diverse human beings. It is a constitution which unfortunately didn't get the language right. And I mean, it's not because of a linguistic struggle at the time. I think it was just because we hadn't evolved our understanding of equity versus equality. Equity is a different, it's a distinct concept from equality, in that, and I always in my feminist teachings, I try to present the idea that equity is about people treating each other the same. And so, for instance, if I were to go and try and access a public hospital, anyone who wants, any person is allowed to access that space. And the only caveat or responsibility is that you're actually going there to go and use that space for the purpose for which it was built. And if you're going to go and use a public hospital as a tavern or as a pub or as a club, then there's a right for the security to deny you access to use the space. because you might be infringing on other people's right to access health. And then the second thing I speak about is that we begin to identify and understand who are the people who want to access this hospital, and how are we making sure that each of these people have got a reasonable opportunity to access that hospital. That it's not enough for structures to just be there, but what are we doing to remove the obstacles for people to actually access that hospital? And the third layer that I speak about to describe equity is that we have to intentionally and purposefully and very painfully undo the laws, structures, systems, policies that were put in place to oppress people who did not live up to the stereotype of the supreme human being. And that is a very painful process, because we not only undo, but we also have to build. So for instance, when we are building our spaces, are we making sure that it's accessible for people who are blind or who are deaf or who are wheelchair users? How are we intentionally building our societies anew to accommodate every single spectrum of human being, regardless of their difference in gender, sexuality, socioeconomic class, etc.? And so our constitution, legitimately through Section 9, provides for us to do that. That's why we're fighting for feminism, or else we would be fighting for feminism to be entrenched in different parts of the constitution. But we're saying, but hold on, we've got a constitution that protects people of different sexual orientations, people of different genders, people who are pregnant, people of different socioeconomic classes, cultures, races, ethnicities, people who come from different origins. And so why then is it that even though we have that protection, we are not experiencing that? We're experiencing something that is very counterintuitive to what has actually been written down. And so what we need to understand is that South Africa is also a very constitutionally illiterate country. We do not understand the Constitution, and those programs that were put into place to teach, like the CLASSY program, the Constitutional Literacy and Education program in South Africa, was defunded. So we don't even, the leaders, or at the very least, don't even hold that in high regard. And just taking from what Ma'am Gail spoke about in the beginning, we don't even understand the relationship between one another. So all we can do is to understand that the government ought to be providing RDP housing, ought to be doing X, Y, Z. But what are we doing between one another as private individuals to ensure that we are living up to the tenets of the Constitution? So people's backlash, it's not because necessarily it was a bad thing to say. It's because people didn't understand what I was saying, because they had not even reconciled themselves with the Constitution. And then, of course, there were the other people who were very technical to speak about land rights. And I was like, but hold on, I didn't say it was a perfect document. I said, though, that it has the underpinnings of a constitutional document. Even when you look at how it was made, when the Bill of Rights was being formed, they made sure that a majority of the people who were in the room were women, and those women were fighting for feminist rights, you know? And so from its technical construction and conception to what we actually see visibly, the language of equity might not be there, and that's fine. But the result and the outcome is that we have a document that purports to make South Africa an equitable society. And we need to protect that. And more than criticizing that, we need to be doing everything in our power to ensure that we make those words a lived reality. And so making a production like this becomes one of the parts that we are playing in making it a reality, because we are educating people now. We are no longer trying to fight for XYZ rights to be protected. It's already there. Mm. But what are we doing tangibly to make sure that it becomes a practical and lived experience for every single human being?
Thank you very much. I want to give the last question to Nico. I loved what you were saying about disruption and the need for disruption, but I want to bring you back. You know, earlier when Gail started out, she made the point of patriarchy likes to put women together, and I think one of the ways that it puts women together is an intergenerational way. You know, young feminists, older feminists, who's a feminist, who's not a feminist, etc. And I wondered if you would speak to that. I mean, you know, it's a feminist then felt very young. It spoke to a young audience. What is the room there for an intergenerational collaboration on feminist work?
You know, I can't imagine any of the work that I have done. You know, especially in my younger years, like 5 years ago, without having been led by, taught by, supported by, encouraged by, you know, feminists that have been doing this work, that have actually inspired my career choices, you know, from years back. So, yeah, I mean, tensions can exist, disagreements can exist, they do, because I think that there are different generational pressures, right? That I think younger feminists go through, and some journeys are not shared, right? So sometimes, you know, this is just one taboo I think exists in the feminist space, is that, you know, disagreement is also not always welcomed or encouraged. And I do think that there should be more room for, you know, different feminists of different generations to disagree with each other, particularly on approach. One case in point, so I was also part of the total shutdown, which took place on the 6th of August in 2018, where women from across the country came together to protest against GBV, which then led to what we saw with the National Summit on Gender-Based Violence, and now what we know as the NSP. Particularly in those sort of planning stages, there were disagreements because, you know, there's a particular generation of, you know, 2015, 2016 young university feminists whose approach to things was sort of less diplomatic, right? Whose approach to things was a bit more robust. And we had to come together and work with women who some identify as feminists, who are working in policy, who are working in government, right? Who have the president's ear, right? And yes, we have a shared common goal. We have shared interests, which in this particular example was the eradication of gender-based violence in South Africa. Our approaches, though, were particularly different, you know, because those who have more professional years are more diplomatic than the younger ones who are emerging out of university spaces. And so then what happens is that, you know, there's a butting of heads, and, you know, there's a whole discussions about who's going to take which responsibility, et cetera, and then sort of decisions are made along those lines, where you see younger women being made the mouthpieces and the voices, you know, that will speak in front of the media because they'll carry a more radical message, because there's less for them to lose, because they can, you know, say things that otherwise those who have to respond to the bureaucrats, you know, would not be comfortable saying. And while that works as a strategy, 5 years on, now wanting to sort of rebrand myself to be more professional, you know, you kind of have to, you know, there are parts where I think I'm still having to explain myself for my radicalism, which I'm unapologetic about, of 2016, but then still have to now carry the burden of, you know, coming into myself in my later 20s to be someone who wants to participate in policy now, who wants to take the kind of, you know, sort of work forward, et cetera, et cetera. And, you know, with youth comes naivety. And I think this is going to be a thing that happens across all types of industries. But I do think there is room for more support, for more guidance, for more dialogue, and really to be open to sort of disagree about approaches and things. Yeah.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you so much. If you have any questions on content for Lesedi, on the program and the constitution, legal aspect, but also just being unapologetically feminist for both Tando and Nico, please do add it into the Q&A. They are still on the program for a little while and can answer your questions directly on the Q&A. I mean, I really think that each of these panels could have been an hour and a half. We're about to move into our third panel. And now our discussion really is about balancing free speech and disrupting patriarchy. So we're going to our next three panelists are each going to take 5 minutes to introduce their opening topics, and then we'll move into Q&A. And our first panelist is Lynette Kameneth. I wonder if we can get the panelist up on the screen. Excellent, thank you very much. Lynette Kameneth is the Manager of Communication and Public Education at the Film and Publication Board. Our second speaker is Tarisai Nyamwenda from Genderlink. She is a Communications Manager for Social Change. And our third speaker is the Chief Executive Officer of Decano, Lebo Ramafoko, who you've all heard about quite extensively today, former CEO of Soul City, and really kind of was there with Rise, was there, and was also the advisor on It's a Feminist Thing. So I don't want to waste any more time. We'll put their bios into the chat, and we're going to move straight on with Lynette, who's just going to give us an overview of what the Film and Publications Board does. So over to you, Lynette. 5 minutes, please. Thanks.
Okay, thanks so much, and thanks for the opportunity for the Film and Publication Board to present to you today. I just wanted to check if they can put my slides up, please. Okay, perfect. So if maybe you can minimize it slightly, I think it looks as if it's cutting off on the screen, well, on my side anyway. Okay, let me start. So you can just move to the next slide for me. So we've been asked to just present on what it is that we do as the Film and Publication Board, and we've been given quite a short time. So I'm going to try and be as quick as possible. So just to sketch a bit of a background for you on the environment that the Film and Publication Board, I'm actually just going to say FPB. It's just a lot simpler on the tongue. So we are an entity of government, and we trace our roots back to the birth of democracy in South Africa. So we are a country that is renowned for having one of the most progressive constitutions in the world. Which is very much focused on the balancing of human rights. And I think Gail spoke extensively about that in her introduction. So within that context, I think on the ground where we work, this sort of balancing of various human rights is not always just a simple sort of X plus Y is equal to Z type of equation. Especially in a country which is so rich in diversity, various cultures, various races, even various nationalities. We have quite a few immigrants in the country. So there's a lot of diversity, and this makes the balancing of human rights very critical and very difficult. So when you add into that mix the fact that we're very much solidly within a digital society at the moment, We have access to limitless information, much more than ever before in human history. There are increasing all the time number of content sources and content platforms, and this sort of makes the complexity of balancing of rights even more challenging. And why I say that is because the same content platforms that are out there providing information to citizens also provides those citizens with the chance to make their voices heard. And the right to free expression is something that is paramount in South Africa. So our citizens can use this power that they have to fight injustices, such as we had something called the total shutdown movement here in South Africa a couple of years ago, and I think is probably still ongoing, that fights against gender-based violence. Another example is a filmmaker creating a movie, which Laurie actually alluded to earlier, that examines things like toxic masculinity in a traditional cultural context. But these citizens can equally use the power that is now in their hands to launch online attacks on female journalists, for example, something that's happened to us in the past, laying bare sort of the underlying patriarchal and sexist attitudes that do still exist in our country. On our school grounds, we have children that can now escalate bullying like a millionfold by shaming their fellow students online. In a recent case, this fueled sort of a suicide as well, which is just goes to show the more serious side that these sorts of power struggles can take when they go onto a social media or an online platform. If you can change the slide for me, please. So the primary duty of the Film and Publication Board is to regulate content, and this is to guard against the breakdown of social cohesion and to work to support through things like change communications to support nation building. We sort of then work towards bringing about a more cohesive society, and as I said earlier, it's not an easy task. The digital revolution is triggered a global village like we've never seen before. You know, content, what we call content travelability. Content is now available freely throughout our continent, for example. So the pre-democracy equivalent of the FPB was the censorship board, which basically had the power to ban any content that they deemed undesirable. So the FPB is often still tarnished with the same brush. I mean, we sort of came afterwards, but like our country, we've actually come quite a long way as an entity since those dark days of apartheid. And the organization was created to regulate the content specifically of films, games, and certain publications through a process of regulation that we call classification. And this is in a very stark contrast to the pre-democracy process of censorship. If you can go to the next slide for me. I don't want to dwell too much on the sort of legal side of things, the different laws that we sort of subscribe to and are guided by are up on the screen. But our main focus is the Films and Publications Act of 1996, which basically established us as an organization, and which we are currently actually in the process of amending so that we can cover some of the gaps that have been created by this advance of digital technologies. But the most important challenge that we face today is to continue upholding and protecting the rights of citizens by staying in touch with what society sees as acceptable, even as these sort of norms and values are in a constant state of flux and change at the moment. And this is basically what my colleague Laurie was talking about earlier when she spoke about the convergence survey that we do. Okay, next slide for me, please. So You'll see there our core objectives. So the primary aim of content regulation work is that we do is to protect the public from exposure to harmful content or from exploitation, especially of children. So more precisely, we focus on protecting people in our society that are the most vulnerable, the ones who don't have a voice, who possibly can't protect themselves, right? And we do this through what we call classification, or the assigning of age ratings and consumer advisories. We also, and very importantly, work with law enforcement in the country to crack down on things like child sexual abuse material, which is also known as child pornography. And then we work towards behavior change in society by conducting various public education and advocacy campaigns. So I just wanted to illustrate this with some practical examples. So firstly, for example, if we're classifying a film or a game and we add to it an age rating of 7 to 12, and we add a consumer advisory for sex, nudity, or violence, we're basically saying to a parent or a caregiver or a consumer that little Johnny, who's 5 years old, could possibly be negatively affected by watching this film or by playing the game. So if we include a consumer advisory of SV, which is for sexual violence, for example, we are alerting survivors of gender-based violence that the content in the film could possibly trigger, bad memories and re-victimize them in that way. So this just illustrates as well, how we have changed as the Film and Publication Board over the years. This is quite a new category, the SV category, and it came about when we were doing our going out to the public and doing public dialogues, where this, because of the high incidence of GBV in the country, this came out very clearly from our stakeholders, from the public, that we needed a category like this to alert people. So my second last example is we have a member of the public that comes across a website that has content that they feel shows children in a sexual context. They report it to the FPB, and then we have a group of internationally trained child protection officers that are equipped to analyze the content on these websites, the images, the videos, to confirm if it's a child that is portrayed and that they've been obviously exploited for the creation of this child pornography. We then escalate it to law enforcement, and we work with them to put together a case to investigate and to prosecute. And then my last example, there's a school in a specific district or town in South Africa that has had instances either of bullying or cyberbullying, or it's an area that just has a lot of child abuse and violence. We are then on call at any time through all our networks and stakeholders that we have to provide public education workshops to the learners, to the teachers, and as well as to the parents on things like cyber safety, policies in schools, child sexual grooming. And we work very closely as well with a variety of stakeholders, such as your school governing bodies, your law enforcement, even online and traditional distributors, such as your Googles and your Facebooks. They often come along with us and do that sort of education with us. And this is part of what we do in terms of the change of behavior communications in our communities. And some of our flagship campaigns are Child Protection Week, Women's Month, 16 Days of Activism, and our Safer Internet Day. So if you can go to the next slide. I don't want to dwell in too much detail on that because
Lynette, we've got 1 minute to wrap up. If you could.
Okay.
for 15.
Okay, sorry. So, okay, I think just if you can move to the next slide that says classification. I just wanted to very quickly, Paula, if it's possible, to just touch on, some of the outcomes that we see with our classification. So, classifications where we basically give the ratings to a film or a game, and it's an advisory, as I was saying, to the public. But we do this in a way that we always have public consultation and dialogue. We come up with a set of classification guidelines, we call them, and this is basically a tool that is used by our classifiers to make sure that we're balancing those rights, so that we're looking at things, and our classifiers are actually trained on this all the time, on how do they create a balance in the ratings that they're giving. So we look at things like the context of the film or the game. So if there's educational, scientific, artistic, literary merit to a film, that is balanced against the harm that the actual portrayal of the scenes can cause. We also look at things like theories of child psychology when we're setting up these guidelines. And just very, very quickly, I wanted to say, I'm not sure what sort of sectors our audience comes from, but just quickly, some of the trends we've picked up. If you are interested in doing behavior change type of communication through the media, through a film or a game, something we've noticed in the last few years is that we've seen a trend for film festivals increasing. So I would basically say to the audience, that's a platform that is good to use. We saw sort of in the past 3 years, we saw an increase in film festivals in South Africa from about 8 that were registered with us to 21 in the past year that was registered with us. The other thing very quickly is that we're also seeing a very sharp decrease in the types of films that are being sent to us for classification for younger viewers. So if we're wanting to get in at an early stage to start training children, about patriarchy, about not being prejudicial towards other people and discriminatory or sowing hate, I would say that the films and games at that age limit of sort of your we call your PG or your all ages or your like 7 to 12 age groups, those are quite low. Same thing with on the game side.
Thanks,
very few games in South Africa for younger kids.
Thank you very much. I need to stop simply because we're almost 20 minutes now, and we're really going to run out of time for the other speakers.
Apologies.
The presentation is available, and we can share it with everyone else. And we certainly will do it because it's very it is incredibly comprehensive and really kind of well presented. I do apologize for having to interrupt you like that. But I do want to also go on now to Tarisai from Gender Links, who's going to share a little bit about about their programming and how it impacts on today's discussion. So Tarisai, over to you.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much for having us to be part of this discussion on a topic that is very dear to us, a topic that has really been the bedrock of the organization's work for the past 20 years. Just to give a brief background about who Gender Links is and what we do. Gender Links is a women's rights organization that is based in Southern Africa. It works across the 15 Southern African countries, and it works in the areas of feminist movement building. It works with local government authorities in terms of gender mainstreaming at that level. And our first program, that is Gender in the Media. And really our gender and media work is guided by the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, which identified media as one of the critical areas of concern. And then at the regional level, our work around gender, the media is guided by the SADC Protocol on Gender and Development, which we use as a roadmap to contributing to achievement of gender equality in the SDGs. So basically our gender and media work, it contributes to feminist media activism through various ways. We have done media training, media research, media monitoring, and advocacy work. And Gender Links identifies the media as a catalyst for change within feminism. And as such, we look at the media through a two-pronged approach, where we identify the media as a site for change as well as a tool for change. And when we look at the media as an institution and as a site for change, we're looking at the media and its responsibility and its accountability to its own audiences, and as such, there needs to be better representation of women. There needs to be gender equality within that space. But also as a tool, we're looking at the media as a vehicle that we can use to promote awareness on gender equality, awareness and gender sensitivity, and to help change attitudes and perceptions within our societies. So this is the approach that we've taken even in the trainings that we continue to do with the media. So to bring about this change, we've worked extensively to strengthen media practice in terms of news content production, as well as in institutional practices. And then on the institutional practices side, we have worked with media houses to come up with policies that speak to eradicating sexist cultures and practices that are prevalent in many newsrooms across the region. And by encouraging the media houses to have maybe more women in the media, setting targets, and also committing themselves to creating and enabling environments where there is equality, an environment where the dual roles of women are recognized within these newsrooms, so as to keep women within the media space, and also to ensure that women participate effectively within the media industry. And research that we have conducted over the years, and that also which has been conducted by like-minded organizations working in this space, whether it has been at country level or at regional level globally, shows really similar trends around underrepresentation of women and women's issues on the media agenda, stereotypical representations and portrayals, and also so many missed opportunities to put gender equality on the media agenda. And this is because of lots of reasons that are very systemic and within the space, ranging from the individual socialization and experiences, but also within the industry, the policies and editorial lines of the media houses, the economic pressures that lead to cost cutting and favoring less expensive forms of reporting, little or no verification, where there's a lot of armchair journalism, where people are not going out to the fields to collect stories from the communities and talking to diverse people who are going to bring different energies to the media. So taking all this, for example, into consideration, we find that there is a gap that we can fill in terms of awareness raising and encouraging or strengthening knowledge about gender issues within the media. And generally for the media to understand how to avoid gender biased reporting and ensure that there is more attention being paid to gender balance in the news, whether it is in terms of the news content that is produced, whether it is in terms of the voices that actually speak through the media. Also identifying non-stereotypical ways to present content in a more gender sensitive and gender responsive manner. So therefore, gender sensitivity training, as we look at it, for example, here in South Africa, we are doing gender sensitivity. We will be doing gender sensitivity training with support from GIZ to promote gender sensitivity in news broadcast media, as well as storytelling and entertainment media production. So we really hope that the media practitioners will take part in this process. We're prompted to go through the processes of self-reflection, to identify those biases that may creep into the media content that they produce, and identify the gaps that are in the media, that are there in the media, and be enabled through the training to change those practices to raise awareness around gender equality. But also, most importantly, we will also be training around gender-based violence and sensitivity when approaching issues to do with gender-based violence in the media, in the news media, as well as portraying them through entertainment media, and what ways really guidelines we can give to the media practitioners to get to a space where there is better reporting and where there is better content in terms of entertainment content. So really this training will help the journalists understand the attitudes, the prejudices, the biases and socialization that often come through in media messages. And as I mentioned earlier, the research that we do training was identified as one key area that continues to lack. Of course, we've done so many training sessions, but that area continues to lack, and there's always new ways, new innovative ways to engage the media, new topics to engage the media on. So as it was identified as a key recommendation in both the Southern Africa Gender and Media Progress study that we do at Gender Links, as well as the research that we did in 2019 together with GIZ. So we continue to find the need to strengthen media practice and arm the media with skills to see all sides of the story, to bring in diverse voices and perspectives of that, not just that of any positions of power and formal authority, but to also delve deeper through in-depth reporting, through showing the differential impact of news and issues on women, because every news story has a gender aspect to it. Therefore, it is important for us as activists, feminist media activists, to harness the power that the media has and to strengthen it, to strengthen this already existing capacity for the media to be more aware and to stem out those gender biases inherent in the work and final media products. So
excellent. Tarisai, we have to end it there, but I wanted to ask, how would there are a number of media organizations on the call today, how would they be able to find out about when they can sign up? Is it possible for you to put that into the chat, and so that they can have that available for them? Yeah, and is it available to journalists in the region or just South Africa?
This GIZ project is mainly on broadcast news media and entertainment media. So put more details. I think if you follow is also there on the call. We are doing it together with GIZ for South Africa only.
Okay, yeah. Let's leave it there then. And then again, if you've got any questions, please put it into the Q&A so that Tarisai can answer you there. And then we'll try and put some more details into the chat. But certainly in the follow-up email to this training, I think we will put these resources there. And I would say to you, if you're in media and you care about gender representation, you should be following Gender Links on social media, and you should be going to their website and looking at their resources. They do excellent work and they have excellent resources available for you. And it would be a good idea really to link up with them as much as possible. We're going to move now to our third speaker on this panel, the Chief Executive of Tekano, Lebo Ramafoko, who was the advisor on the drama before it was stopped by COVID, and did some incredible work there. So Lebogang, over to you to share your thoughts with us in terms of gender representation in programming.
Thank you very much, and thank you for Soul City for having me. I retitled my talk on and called it "What I Have Learned Doing Social and Behavior Change Communications in the Last Almost 30 Years." And these are the thoughts that I want to share with the attendees today. Firstly, everything is a message, from who owns media, who creates media, who is in front of your screen, what they represent, what they say, who gets an award, who doesn't get an award. Everything is a message. And even at the very beginning of Soul City, and I joined Soul City in 1995, it was very, very clear that media is often used to advance an anti-feminist agenda, that largely media supports capitalism, it supports consumerism, and it also supports patriarchy, where women are seen as there for the men's gaze. And one of the very important agendas, apart from what was on screen from Soul City, was to pay attention to who creates the media. And I remember early in the days, in the very early to mid 90s, where the word authenticity about which are the media houses that are going to represent the stories that Soul City wanted to tell then, even when they were stories about health and development and dealing with the social and structural determinants of health, it was also important to know which are the production houses. And at that time, we even started by insisting that each and every production company that basically produced for Soul City actually has a training component. Because the first thing that we discovered even early then was that the media was mainly controlled by white, male, heterosexual. So that is where the whole issue of disrupting what was the dominant narrative started. So I think for me, I want to say that freedom of speech or any speech is not neutral, and the media is not neutral. And I think when we speak about disrupting patriarchy and we want to see different stories being told, we need to understand that everything is a message. And I am very glad that over the years, up to where we are right now, or where Soul City is at right now, I and in the organization was very adamant about who are the people that tell stories. So female-owned production companies, Black-owned production companies, like One Man and His Dog and others. It was very important for me that we make sure that as an organization, the work that we do is produced by them. You know, some of these things that I'm talking about, and I think that is why it is taking so long for us to even realize them, is that they are like oxygen, if I am to describe it that way. They are so, they are there, but you can't see them. So for an example, when you've got a treatment that is sent by a male heterosexual writer and one that is sent by, you know, somebody else, you can see just how they treat the character around, you know, what is their orientation. So for me, the idea of disrupting patriarchy is one that understands that there is an agenda in the media, and that agenda is anti-feminist. And therefore, while we recognize that the medium is powerful and we've got every right to own and use that medium, and I think social media has made it even, you know, has democratized it even more. Every, you know, year, every month, you are learning of different platforms of how you can actually even disrupt who owns and who communicates. We need to understand that you cannot engage with these platforms without having a very explicit and unapologetic feminist agenda. So for an example, if you do not have a clear agenda, you will consume uncritically. And we have seen how, for an example, you know, social media is really used, people even creating bots to fight feminist agendas. How women who will speak up on rape and other issues that affect women will be followed and hounded, you know, by those who are intentionally wanting the status quo to remain. So part of what we need to do in terms of really disrupting patriarchy is to understand that everything is a medium. And for me, what is very important, and I think it's a feminist thing, both the idea of the drama, the PSAs, and the talk show, at least the intention of the AWDF was very clear that who creates is as important and who is creating. And I don't think that in this discussion, we can leave out the crisis that has happened in South Africa, in the public broadcaster, but also in other parts of Africa, around how the agendas of the broadcasters, around who they silence and who they do not silence, or who they allow and which stories they allow, is something that we also need to problematize, and we need to look at very, very intentionally and very, very critically. We have seen how in the paid media, poverty has become like the American model, where poor people have created, we've had shows like the Jerry Springer and others being created. We have seen how this patriarchal agenda has also influenced channels like Moja Love, the stories that get told on different platforms. So we need to look at who creates, what do they create, in understanding that everything is a message. So I think for me, my remarks are, this work needs a lot of, I think, support. And when I talk about support, I'm talking about intentional support, about who also owns media. It's about how intentional are we in the stories that we tell, to be Pan-African, to be feminist, and to basically disrupt and challenge the narrative. But it's also about the platforms that we find some of our stories on. I don't think that it's coincidental that this morning we woke up, or yesterday, we woke up to these stories breaking, even around COVID, which may seem unrelated, about digital vibes, or whoever they call themselves, having received a whole lot of money for work that we cannot see even during a pandemic. So even the support that some of our agencies support, the films that get supported, the media houses that get supported, the productions that get supported, where money is spent, is as important a conversation around what is the kind of messaging that you put in. Because by the time you get to messaging, unless you have addressed and are very clear that you are addressing the agendas of everybody in the value chain, in South Africa and across the board, you will not get the media that will transform patriarchy. If we don't look at industry, it is not a coincidence that every male, Black male person, and now women, a famous person, people we call influencers, have had the alcohol industry support them. And they've got beverages that that they are endorsing and that they are supporting. Over and above who they select and what they select, they have also then matched Black excellence to whom we call so-called influencers. And unless, we take this disruption of patriarchy to also look at the kind of media, the kind of advertising, all kinds of media that is produced, and the role of industry as well in the creation of this media, we will be but on the periphery. While the work of gender-sensitive training is important, I want to say the argument and the fight, because we are in a war, particularly as women in Africa and in South Africa in particular, we are in a war with patriarchy. Unless we question all of these stakeholders, including the private sector, if you look at MultiChoice and the budgets that they have and what gets produced and who produces what they consume, unless we talk about all of those holders of power, we will be on the periphery. So what I have learned is that it is not only about the messaging, where Soul City was at the forefront of creating a methodology of testing, a methodology of making sure that you inform that with research, a methodology of first you do no harm, that we have a body of knowledge on. But we cannot take it for granted that who owns the media, who controls the media, who spends money on which media is as an important side for contestation. It is as important a side for us to basically disrupt the patriarchy that has even made those media houses. The fact that globally, largely speaking, media is male, white owned says something about the fact that we have just scratched the surface. The fact that in every African country and abroad, but mainly where many audiences are really relying on the public broadcaster, that the politicians and the political parties, are holding on to them and controlling them and paralyzing them, is as important a conversation and a debate to have as it is to say what is the message in the stories that we want to tell. I'll stop there, Paula, because I think my 5 minutes is up, but those were just my thoughts, unless there are more questions or discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lebo. Those are really critical questions to be asking. I want to ask the one question, and that is, from in your perspective, what should we be doing about the fact that the media is white male owned? What should we be doing?
Well, I think we've got trinkets of people mentioning that and coming together and saying what it is that we can do about this. But largely, in my opinion, is that there isn't a movement of media practitioners across different mediums to really question and discuss the issues that I am that I am raising. I also, so in a lot of ways, and it's issues of money. So some production companies will only produce really cutting edge, groundbreaking media, including organizations like Soul City, when they only have funding. But I do think that, with the different platforms that are there and the different ways in which we could do media, it's one thing that we, everybody who's interested in using media to disrupt patriarchy can come together. And all of us that are here, from the attendees to the panelists, could come together and create a movement that is going to call to question a number of the issues that myself and the different panelists have spoken about. You are on mute, Paula.
I want to do a shout out here to Soul City and an acknowledgement that the very deliberate strategy of empowering black women-owned businesses in order to tell these stories is something that can be replicated by other people who are doing campaigns, by corporate South Africa, well, not only corporate South Africa, by corporations across the continent. I think it's a really critical first step. Thank you very much, Lebeka, for that. It was really insightful. We're moving on to our next panel now, but first we're going to show a PSA.
Ayanda sana lam. Siyakwamkela kolusapho lwethu. Ungowethu ngoku. Ususala namhlanje ke siza kunika igama elitsha ozawubizwa ngalo. Igama lakho elitsha izaba nguRudzani.
Rudzani ngwananga achitata khani na mirado ya hoyu muta. Ndikhoria si boardroom apa ngwananga. Ndiatenda uri ompfa.
Ga re atla go tshameka fa e se kgale re solofetse lesia le lentse le taboga ka maotunyana fa kana bana ke leruo la legae ke solofela ga ke utlwagetse.
Thank you very much. And we have in the next panel discussion the director of that PSA to come and share with us on the challenges involved in feminist television production and experiences that they had on the It's a Feminist Thing talk show. We have two speakers in this panel discussion. We've got Machepo Maya, who is a director of, and she directed both Joggers and Goyala. She is an award-winning filmmaker. She's a director at the Star Film Company with a passion for storytelling and crafting natural and riveting performances. Our second speaker is Nolwazi Tusini, who is a senior researcher but also a scriptwriter for It's a Feminist Thing, and she's a journalist, an activist, a speaker. As a journalist, she's worked in South Africa's biggest newsrooms and she's worked on global stories. She also works as a social justice practitioner, teaching race and gender literacy in South African schools. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Nolwazi to speak first, 5 minutes of your key points, and then we'll end off with Director Machepo Maja. Nolwazi?
So thank you so much for the introduction, Paula, and thank you to Soul City and Gail for inviting me to this conversation. I think in terms of my opening remarks, taking into consideration the people that we have on this webinar who are media practitioners, etc., was for me to just talk about feminist media and also creating feminist content as a media product. So as Paula has said in her introduction, I was one of the senior researchers on the team for It's a Feminist Thing, and one of the script writers as well. And my career essentially is as a journalist. I'm a journalist by profession, and I work as an executive content producer in the media space, news media space in South Africa. So news, broadcast news in particular, so radio and television. And I want to talk a little bit about, what I think are the most important things if you are a person who is working in particular in the content space of any country that you're in, and trying to ensure that a feminist agenda becomes centralized to the ways in which you cover stories that are supposedly not about feminism, right? So the most important thing for me going into this project, which is It's a Feminist Thing, and the most important question that I ask myself, even just as a producer of news, is who is the audience, right? Which is a thing that we grapple with. So when you talk about who the audience is, you're talking about two things. The first thing that you're talking about is who is the audience that you are specifically wanting to speak to, which is what we call the target audience, which obviously we then got from Soul City, whose interest was in young women, right? Of some of them late teens and some of them early 20s. So as we were thinking through the content, it was very important for me to establish the fact that the people that we want to talk to are young women in South Africa, and specifically young Black women in South Africa. Then there's a secondary, consideration in terms of the audience, which is who else will see this message, and that speaks to the platform on which you put this product. And for us, it was obviously on the national broadcast, and Lebogang, I think, has beautifully spoken about some of the concerns around the national broadcaster in South Africa and the ways in which they silence certain conversations and certain voices. So we had an understanding that this would go onto the SABC, which is the national broadcaster, and SABC2 specifically, which is a channel that targets a particular kind of audience, a family audience of various kind of languages. So when we're considering the content, this is what we're talking about. Who do we want to talk to specifically, and who else will possibly be in the room, right? And then the second thing in terms of thinking about your audience is what context do they exist in? And the context, of course, is South Africa, where we have one of the most lauded constitutions in the world. But in terms of women and queer peoples and marginalized groups' actual experience of the constitution, and I think that Tando lauded to it earlier on, it doesn't match what the document says, right? So Tando talks about a particular illiteracy around the constitution. I would like to talk about the values gap between who the constitution says we are as South Africa and as a nation, and who we actually are in reality, and in the ways in which people experience their rights in this country, which is why I found it quite, Laurie's comments in the morning, quite interesting in terms of how the Films and Publication Board chooses to classify certain things and the surveys that they do. Because, for me, particularly with the Inleba thing, I disagreed with some of the decisions that the Film and Publications Board meant, because I felt that as a queer person, they were speaking to who South Africa is in terms of experience, and not necessarily who South Africa is supposed to become and who we're supposed to reimagine ourselves into.
I think that she's just lost. Nolwazi has just lost her computer. We'll wait. If she manages to get back up, while we're still doing, she'll rejoin the conversation. But while we wait for her, I wonder if we could move, Mashepa, if we could move to you, and ask you for your opening remarks, because I think it will take a few minutes for Nolwazi to connect and restart. So, please go ahead.
Hi, thank you
Hi.
very much for for having me on board. I'm so glad I made it in time to catch you guys live. Thank you, Paula, and thank you to the Soul City Institute for this opportunity. It's really fantastic to have these spaces and open spaces to talk about these issues. As a director, I've been in this industry for the past 10 years, and it took 7 years for me to even get into a position of being a director, a Black female director, leading and taking the shot, calling the shots from a senior HOD perspective. And, I've gone through the mills, over the past 10 years, growing and, trying to come up and push for more spaces, for more female directors, for more female voices to be heard, especially in film and media, which is practically run mainly by, by males and the white male industry. And when people think of a director, usually their image is not this face. Usually the first thing when people think of a film director, they think, it's usually a white male face, or the next to that would be a white female face before even getting to a person of color. So for me, having gone through a personal journey of trying to make space for myself to be heard, make space for more females in the HOD positions and more of our stories to be told from our perspective. It's a really, really important thing. And that's why I absolutely jumped so quickly when Pelisa, the producer, got a hold of me about participating in doing these PSAs, because in highlighting, for example, in Jogger and Oyala, there are so many topics that us as women know and can identify with and go, but hold on, if these stories are about us, firstly, one, we need more strong stories about, women and the female story to be told by women, and not necessarily by men, and to tell stories that kind of paint a picture of what we go through. So I don't think it comes across very easily for most people, especially the industry, to understand that, well, there's a whole dynamic when it comes to female-led stories, and it's not just about female-led stories, but issues that affect women ultimately on a day-to-day basis, and how we can bring those to light, and re-educate society and going, well, these stories are about us. This is what we're going through. This is what we are feeling as women, as a society. I don't feel safe running. I don't feel safe going out for a jog without having to ensure that I've called maybe 3 people to know where my route is or where I'm going to, or to have pepper spray. And it's not even about what I look like or how I dress anymore when I go into public and when I want to go and exercise, even if I'm fully covered. And that's what we wanted to ensure that we kind of pushed in the Jogger PSA was, it's not our fault that we get attacked, even if you are fully covered and dressed and not showing a single, piece of skin on you, and yet we are constantly in danger, and that is not right. That is not fair. That is not right. And it's important to bring those matters to light, and it's important to bring those social matters to light, because we need to start changing how society look at women and what they think female, what women go through on a day-to-day basis. And also, more importantly, to be told by women. We'd really tried hard to get an all-female team, because that space is important too. The representation is important too. It's not just the stories that we tell, but who tells those stories. And it's really, and that's something that I constantly am aware of doing, when I'm doing my commercials. I always push for, I want my female HODs. Don't just give me the typical don't just give me the makeup artist, which is usually a female, always assumed to be female. But, I want female, a DOP, a female camera assistant. So those spaces that were not really open to us, and especially in South Africa with a young industry, and we only have like 5-6 female, tech crew, in the commercial space, and it's like, well, that's only 5 out of the entire country. We only have 5 female tech crew. Females can take these roles that are always assumed to be the male role. So part of my agenda in my career has always been about making sure that now that I have the space and the, seniority to be able to call those shots and go who I want on my team, it's really important to push those stories forward, but also important to create the space for women and more women to occupy the space in storytelling, and especially behind the scenes.
Thank you very, very much. I'm just going to give Nawazi an opportunity to finish off her presentation. And then please, we're going to have a couple of questions. So again, asking people to please put your Q&As into the question and answer chat, and then we'll come back to both of them. Nawazi, do you want to finish off?
Yes, please. I just want to apologize. I didn't realize my laptop wasn't charging. I'm now on my phone, so I may not look as great as I did earlier, but I hope you can still see and hear me. So I was saying that the determining who your audience is important, because as a person who's creating content, for me, what's important in an important sort of check and standardization is what's in it for the audience? So it's a question that I asked to the presenters a lot, to my fellow researchers as we're creating the content about what is in it for the audience. What are we trying to communicate? And are we actually communicating what we're trying to communicate? And Gail alluded to this earlier on in the ways in which Lebo was talking them through how they represent a rape scene, etc. And another important thing about determining who your audience is because you want to unpack the issue and not your audience. When I say that, I mean that dealing with the kind of content that we were dealing with on the show, there was an understanding that there were going to be people whose lived experience it is, people who are going to be triggered, right? But the conversation remains important. So I didn't want, when women, feminists, etc., or victims of sexual assault were watching the show, for them to feel unpacked in a space where they're sitting with their families or whatnot, but to really be careful about the fact that we were unpacking the actual content and the conversation and not requiring the audience who might be triggered to be unpacked themselves. And so the work that Olu Lisedi does becomes very close to the work that I do, in the ways in which, first of all, she protects the presenters and ensures that we get the best out of them, but also makes sure that the content sort of metrics are met in terms of what Soul City needs, in terms of what the country needs, in terms of what our audience needs. So those are the things that I really wanted to talk to in the opening, taking into consideration that we've got media professionals in this webinar. And the very last thing is to talk about understanding that we're also creating a media product. And this comes with certain restrictions and ways in which it makes our life difficult. So for example, we have a limited amount of time with a media product, especially a TV media product, that it's 48 minutes to discuss very complex ideas, which is why Tando then is in a situation where she gets a lot of backlash because she doesn't have the time and the space to properly unpack what she means when she says that the Constitution is a feminist document, right? So there's the media imperative that I think that content producers within the media space need to take into consideration and just accept that it is a media product and the constraints that gives you. So in terms of budgets, but also in terms of time, in ways in which you can unpack complex ideas. And then the third thing is also in terms of the audience that you're broadcasting to. If you're on the national broadcaster in South Africa, where there's a values gap between who the Constitution says we are and a very diverse audience, there's certain kind of things that you won't be able to get to, and to be able to first accept that so that you can build into your content ways in which to still deal with that and achieve your objectives whilst doing that within the constraints that you're existing in.
So for both of you, here's a question. How do you create feminist films in a TikTok era? How do you create feminist films, messaging in 7 seconds, right? An optimal time in order to do that. So for Nawazi, for you particularly, I want you to answer that question from the perspective of audience, and measuring against what the audience needs and what the audience wants. So over to both of you.
So here's the thing, Paula, in terms of the TikTok era. When we're talking about the TikTok era, we need to talk about who's consuming TikTok, who's consuming Twitter, right? And who that audience is. TikTok in particular are very young people, right? Who have access to certain kinds of information, right? So the reason why TikTokers can do very complex feminist content and ideas in 7 seconds is because the audience they're speaking to has access to certain kinds of information already, right? And so the complexity can be unpacked very quickly because the people they're talking to, right, are probably people who already know what we're talking about. So it's also the platform and who it is that platform reaches. So in the TikTok era, talking to TikTok people, I can do it in 48 minutes because I don't have to unpack it in the layers in which I have to do on a national broadcaster in South Africa that has a wide range of ages that are watching that kind of content. And it's the same kind of thing of Twitter. Who is it that consumes Twitter in South Africa? It's largely the middle class, right? And so the middle class has access to certain kinds of information already by virtue of the ways in which they use and access digital media, right? Which is why then people on Twitter can nitpick what Tando is saying, right? Because they have certain access to information about our history. But the fundamental point is, when Tando was speaking, she was speaking to an audience on SABC2 on the national broadcaster, right? So when she says that, these are people that need to understand in the first basis that what feminism is, what the feminist document is, etc. And so what happens with middle class people watching that and then putting it on Twitter and giving that critique is that they're not taking into consideration the other people that are watching that might need the quick generalization, right? And so this is what we did even when we were thinking about the content, what goes into each episode, and the fact that the first episode that we did was to explain what feminism is, number one, and number two, to locate feminism in Africa, on the continent, because there's this misconception that feminism is a Western idea. It's not, right? And to foreground African feminisms, right? And then the second thing that we do is we add men to the conversation with the Allies Corner, as Lesedi has said, in breaking down the show, because men must be part of the conversation. But the men that we choose to hold that conversation has to be particular kinds of men, which is why we choose Professor Kopano Ratele, whose work is about what does a progressive and healthy masculinity look like, right? So that men see themselves represented on the screen, but see themselves represented on the screen by someone whom we trust in terms of their location of feminism, right? And the one critique that I would give to this project, and we did, I believe, amazing work, is the ways in which we centered women, we centered feminism, we centered Black women in particular, and tried to center African feminism with the limited amount of space that we had to do that, but we left out the queer community, right? And so I kept on saying when we were doing the content in our meetings, people were talking about how we're doing an intersectional feminist show, and I said to them, we need to let go of intersectionality because we're not being intersectional, because as a queer woman who was on that production team, and Tando was the only other queer woman, to my knowledge, on that team, there was an entire community that was invisibilized in the ways in which we decided to present that content. There was a reason for that, because we understood what our audience, right? And understood and hoped for a second season in order to be able to build, right? And so in the work that I do as a social justice practitioner, I always build concepts based on race, then gender, then sexual orientation, then sexuality, so that to help the human brain to understand it. But the end point is when people arrive in a room, they don't arrive in disaggregated identities. They arrive as a full human being, and we need to take that into consideration. So when you putting a media product together, you have to understand the full human being you want to talk to, disaggregate them because of the audience, but you also need to get to the point where you put the human being back together in order to shift societal perceptions in the ways in which you're wanting to do so.
Thank you very much, Nolwazi. Machepa, last word with you.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with Nolwazi on all fronts on that. And I think when you're dealing with such a short space of time, got 7 seconds, there's no time to unpack a lot, right? You don't have time to kind of create a massive backstory and all this stuff. You're kind of focusing on one single thought. And you want to kind of impact your audience with one single thought. And if you keep that one single thought very clear, that maybe leaves a question at the end, then you got your TikTok medium of 7 seconds where you've created a single thought that leaves you with a question at the end to go, oh, I never thought of something like that. And now you're opening a space for conversation on the platform that can now unpack that 7-second thought, right? Yes. So looking at where you would have 30 seconds for a commercial, you got about 3 spaces there to tell a full story. But when you've got 7 seconds, you want to get the best impact with keeping it simple, keeping it direct, and raising a question that will make people ask themselves when they watch it or consuming it or read it and go, oh, I didn't think of that. So you don't have time to unpack too much, but you do have time to create a question and an impact, a strong question and an impact that will leave whoever's consuming it to now unpack it for themselves and open that conversation up. And I think that is when you are dealing with, TikTok, which is a younger audience, you've got attention spans of very, very short and narrow, but the higher the impact, then you kind of utilizing that 7 seconds into 7 hours of conversation afterwards and going, oh, did you see that? And I think that is how how it's the only way we can package it when we're looking at short format stuff like that. It's creating that immediate high impact question or a thought and leaving that with the audience. And I think if you start engaging and start planting those ideas on TikTok, where it starts raising questions and makes us look at something from a different perspective, it can be utilized and in that productive way. And I think it's just really about creating just making sure that singular thought, gets through, and that's impactful, and that it draws the young audience attention to start asking these questions and going, well, we need to deal with this. How do we get to that?
I literally feel like the conversation has just started, and I have to wrap up. I'm really sorry to do that, but thank you very much, Nwazi. Thank you much, Eva. It's so interesting, so much food for thought. I think there's a lot of stuff for us to be able to absolutely the SEDI, right? I mean, I think we can just kind of give a hand clap for the incredible discussions we've had today. We're right at the end of today's session, can you believe it? But I want to give Lebogang an opportunity to answer a question live from one of the participants. And I also want to ask, is there anyone of the panelists who wants to answer this question from Bongani Maseko of recent black outrage marketing has become a marketing strategy? How do black people call out companies that use the strategy without giving them the hype they were hoping to achieve through the strategy, to achieve it without to address it without making it go viral? But I'm going to hand over to Lebogang first, and then if anyone wants to answer that before we wrap up today's discussions. Lebogang, 1 minute for you.
The question was, how do we deal with anti-feminist women who, despite their achievements, still speak about, feminism as a dirty word? I think one is to recognize that both men and women can support patriarchy because it is a system. And I think the one way in which we do that is that rather than be reactionary, is to tell our own stories and be out there and communicate our own issues. It's the same thing, and there was an earlier question about trolls, is that sometimes, as the person rightfully said, you end up being distracted by what they are saying. And the aim of patriarchy is to tire us and to divide us. And we therefore need to be very strategic in how we continue, speaking our message and demystifying all the myths that there are for feminism and coming together as a collective voice.
Thank you very much. Is there anyone who wants to answer the next question? Perhaps in the actual Q&A box, we'd be really grateful for that. I'm going to do a really quick wrap up. First of all, I think that today's discussions were so rich. We started out saying we wanted to have lively, vibrant discussions. I think what we didn't anticipate was that that there was just so much to say and so many good ways to be able to say it. But I think that some of the things that really stood out for me is to be intentional. Words matter. How we use those words matter. When we use those words matter. And I think one of the things that came through in different ways from different speakers is that we really need to be intentional about the stories we're telling, the words we're using, the examples we're citing, the platforms even that we're using, and to really kind of have a sense of that. The message that everything is a message from Lebogang also rang true for me. What we say and what we don't say, quite frankly, is a message, and I think that's so important. Our work is towards movement building. We're simply not raising awareness here. This is to bring about change. It's to dismantle patriarchy. It's to be able to put together a movement that can actually do that. Lots of sharing about the methodology of social behavior change communication, lots of sharing about how we were able to do that through this process. But I want to be able to leave us all with the thought that, nothing happens until we do something. And so for me, I hope that this is the start of a conversation. There is a lot more that we can unpack, and the fraycollege team have committed to actually trying to edit these clips and write stories about them and put them onto YouTube so that we can go back to them and learn more from them in future. We're going to play 2 more PSAs now, and then Gail is going to come back, so don't leave. We've still got 1 or 2 more words to say, but first we want to share a PSA, and then Gail is going to come back and have some final comments. So over to the PSA.
Hello, Cuckoo, how are you?
Hello, my baby.
How's Mpo? Did you guys get the money I sent for his school books? No, actually it's fine. I'll send more later on in the week. I don't know if I'll be able to get leave from work, but I'll try. Coco, please give Mpo a kiss for me and tell him Mama loves him. Okay, bye.
Thank you so much. Wow. Thank you to everyone. I think for me today is really the stuff that feminist dreams are made of. I am absolutely delighted by the entire discussion today. I've been riveted by it. I'm deeply, deeply grateful to all of the women who contributed to this entire Disrupting Patriarchy project. It was very important to us that we really give space to women to bring the heat from their perspective. They did it on the show, they did it on the PSAs, and they've done it here today. So I just really want to thank every single woman. I believe in naming women, but I think it'll take too long to go through all the names, so I'm not going to. I'm just going to say thank you to all of you, every single one of you. I think for me, working on this project for Soul City has been the realization of both a personal and a political dream, to see an unapologetically feminist show of any kind on South African television, because we have always known that we are here. We have always been unapologetic in this country and in Southern Africa in terms of confronting patriarchy. And we really wanted to get that diversity of opinion, of voices, looks onto screen and behind the screen. So thank you to everyone who participated today and who worked on the project. Great thanks to GIZ, UN Women, all the partner organizations that we've worked with on the broader program to really empower women. Thank you for your inputs today, for showing us not only what is happening, but the context within which we work, so that we can understand them. I'm really, really indebted to everyone who has participated today. To the women who worked on the show, I have no words to thank you, because I think that for me, my job is really the hidebound feminist, the one that didn't really have much sense of humor, because that really was my role, to just make sure that ultimately the feminist message was filtering through and to hold the Soul City line, but also to manage that relationship and not impede the creativity of the people working on it. It was a very difficult balance to withhold then, one's editorial interventions. I want to say thanks to all the male allies who participated, Dr. Kopano Ratele and Dr. Chimese. Those two men, just the show alone, all their clips are teachable moments. As somebody who had to watch every show 4 times, minute by minute, every single time those men appeared on screen, I was riveted and really moved by the analysis of masculinity. So they were integral to it. I want to thank the media, not just journalists, but also the creative industries who have come to the party in so many ways, both on the advisory group, but also on the project. Our media on the show was amazing, really, really amazing. We got incredible coverage of the show. And what was gratifying to see was that the messages, the deep messages, were embedded in the media. So very, very gratifying to see that. I want to say also, just as somebody who's worked in feminism and the media for 25 years, it's very gratifying to see that it is changing. And that there is a lot more space for diversity. I want to invite the media as well. You have seen today the phenomenal women who can provide the kind of analysis that is required on our television shows. Please use them. Please use women's voices, use women's expertise, and get their names right. I think that just finally, in closing, I want to also thank Paula Frey, who is my Neiman sister. She was ahead of me at journalism school and has always been a light for me in terms of leading me as a younger journalist. Slightly younger, but always leading. So thank you so much, Paula. I was able to relax because I knew you and your team were managing things. So just to close and say thank you so much to everyone. From me, it's a very, very personal thanks and goodbye, because this is really actually my last week at Soul City. My contract has ended. It's been 2 phenomenal years. I think getting paid to feminist is the most amazing privilege in the world. I think being given the room that we've been given has been phenomenal. So I personally would like to thank Soul City as well for this incredible opportunity for working with these teams of incredible, incredible women. So for all of the audience who joined us here today, I hope you got something out of it, and thank you very much.